All right, so I'm Hope Medina with Shums Coda Associates, and I live in the world of energy because I fell in the hole and never found my way out of there. So you get me today. All right, so we have a lot to go over. As Gina alluded to, this training is the first one in a series. So today we're going to do like a broad overview of what's in the 21, both residential and commercial. And then throughout the rest of the winter coming into spring, we'll do deep dives into specific topics within the 21. So and those ones will go into a much deeper depth of all of it. I love questions, so ask your questions. Be the brave one, because chances are somebody else in the room has a question and they're too afraid to answer it, so be the brave one for the group and just ask it. This is a safe space. There is absolutely no judgment on it, which I think is important. I love questions. That's how I got here, because poor Gil Rossmiller took my call, or my 15 calls a day, asking all my questions, and he still answered the phone every single time. So big on questions. So real quick, who do we have in the room? How many of you are architects, designers? Okay. Engineers? Okay. Contractors? Code officials? All right. So we have a good mix here. Awesome. All right. So I got a question for you. When we're looking at a building and trying to decide which half of the book to look at, how do we know whether a project is commercial or whether a project is residential? Oh, you guys thought you were going to sit there? No. This is interactive. It's a two-way street going on here. Ooh, you are so close. Yes. So what it is to be a residential building, you're going to be a single family, two family townhouses, but R2s, R3s, and R4s that are 3 stories or less above grade plane are considered to be residential, even if they're being built out of the IBC. Ooh, you guys got quiet. Did I scare you? No? All right, perfect. All right, so here becomes the really fun one, because I don't know if you've noticed, there's been an awful lot of mixed use going on, where the bottom half might be commercial and the top 2 floors may be condos, so we got residential going on. In that instance, what you get to do is you get to play in both halves of the book. So for that bottom floor that we're designating our commercial, it's going to be a coffee shop. I've already decided. So it's this coffee shop, and it's going to have to do everything that's in the first half of the book. The top 2 stories will then have to follow the residential provisions, so the back half of the book. For anything that's 3 stories or less, keep in mind that when we go into the table on the commercial side has Group R, and then a column that says all other. That's not the or the Group R that you're going to follow. You're actually going to go to the residential side of the book. So if in this scenario we have that commercial on the bottom floor and the top 2 floors are residential, how do you deal with the thermal envelope? Any thoughts?
Strictest one. Whichever one exceeds, the greater one.
All right, you guys are both kind of saying the same thing. You can, but just remember that no matter what, the residential provisions cannot, depending on your compliance path, cannot be anything less than what we have in the table. So what's required on the commercial or the residential side is going to differ on the commercial side. Now, how I would address that in this instance is you go with ComCheck and ResCheck, because you can do some wheeling and dealing where, as you guys mentioned, whatever is the most restrictive you could use, or more energy efficient you could use, and you may be able to trade something off that you're doing for the commercial side on the residential side. But how it would work is for that bottom floor, which is what you're going to get a comm check for. You're going to have your slab edge insulation if it constitutes needing slab edge insulation. It's going to have all your walls, your windows, your doors, anything that's associated with that bottom floor. The thing it won't have is information about the roof. And that's because that first floor is not in direct communication with that roof. And it's okay. You can have a comm check that does not contain a roof on there and still pass it. Then what you're going to do for your top 2 stories is you're going to go into res check, and in res check you're going to put the information for the walls, windows, doors. You aren't going to put information about the floor or the slab because that's on the first floor, but what it will have is the information for the roof. So basically when you put the 2 reports together, you have an entirety of the building demonstrating that it meets the requirements out of both sides of the book. And it also allows for you to be able to basically have a single design for your thermal envelope. So instead of having my thermal envelope on the first floor is going to be XYZ, and then I have to do something different for the next 2 floors, in theory, you could just have all 3 floors be the same thermal envelope components because you've done comm check where you're allowed to do some trading abilities on it. Does that make sense to everyone? Questions? I usually get questions with this one. All right. So what do you say? Is this commercial, residential? Commercial? Okay. All right. Since it happens to be commercial, let's go ahead and take a look at all the provisions that we have in the commercial side of the book. This is my absolute favorite section in the code. Anybody know why it's my favorite section in the code?
Saves you money.
It can absolutely save you money. I'll tell you how in just a minute.
It gives you a scope list.
It gives you a list of everything that must be provided on the, it says construction documents. Now in the 21, a lot of times there is, and even in the previous editions, a lot of times when people think of construction documents, it's not necessarily the rolled up set of plans. Sometimes they're thinking about the rolled up set of plans and the spec book. A lot of things get hidden in the spec book and don't translate onto the plans, and we don't get that out in the field. And so the nice thing, not to like spoiler alert or anything, in the 2024 edition, they really specify, they've created a new definition about what construction documents are and how they expressed it. And since I sat and listened to this from the people who were doing it, they are saying that everything on this list has to be on those rolled up set of plans. So I love this list because it lets us know all the things that we need to have on the plans that are going to help us ensure that we get energy compliance. Now, how this saves money. If you know what you have to do, then there isn't going to be this back and forth, because I can't tell you how many times I've had to write a review comment up because I don't get the R value or I don't get the material of what the insulation is going to be. And I've had people say, well, is it really that big of a deal to know what material your insulation is going to be? Anybody have any thoughts? Why I would care?
Changes my load calcs.
It can change your load calcs. Absolutely. Absolutely does. What else?
Fire separation.
Fire, yes. Those UL listings are incredibly explicit about the type of insulating material you can use and what the R value has to be for that rated assembly. What else? How about vapor retarder strategies? So in the IRC and the IBC and the IECC even has a marker to it that sends you to the IBC and IRC for vapor retarder controls, because we have to ensure that we do not have a class 1 vapor retarder on the outside of the building and have one on the interior side of the building. So I have to know what type of material is going into that wall assembly or roof assembly to ensure that we have all of these components working together harmoniously. Now, the only code that requires it for it to be called out is the energy code. So there, in that instance, how it can save money is the back and forth that happens between plan review and all that. If I have all of this information on the plans, 9 times out of 10, you get very few review comments from me. It's little things that obviously have a big impact. Sometimes I don't get load calculations or something of that nature, but it's incredibly important. This information sets a project up to succeed, and that's the idea of what we want to do here. All right, so in the 21, it called out number 1, and I will tell you, I will take responsibility for it because I submitted it as a code change that said you have to place on the plans and tell me what energy code compliance path you chose for this project. Because I can't tell you how many times I would get a comm check and I would get a cut and paste of the table also. And it's like, well, which one are we doing? And then somewhere along the lines, there'll be a note that says, follow the report from C407. So I think it's just easier to know right off the bat, because that lets me know, am I looking for a specific report? Is there some flexibility that's getting built in? Because certain compliance paths have certain flexibility built into it. So here are the options for the commercial side. You got prescriptive. If it's prescriptive, you can't just have it listed as prescriptive. There are 3 options within prescriptive: R value, U factor, C factor, F factor method, and then you also have the component performance alternative, which is comm check. So we need to know which one of the prescriptive path you're choosing, because each one of them have different documentation that's needed. The next one is your total building performance. This is where you're going to do like some energy modeling. You're going to trade things off more than just the thermal envelope. Maybe it's the performance of the equipment. Maybe it's, your internal gains. Whatever the case may be, you get a lot more flexibility about what you're trading, but you also get modeling to it. And then we have the third option in there, which is ASHRAE 90.1. It's a completely separate document. It's an energy standard that is deemed to be equivalent to the IECC. But if you do choose to go with ASHRAE 90.1, just be aware it's an all or nothing type of situation. So prescriptive. Let's talk a little bit about what these are and kind of how you need to comply with the code with each of these. So we've got our insulation component R value based method. We got our U factor, C factor, F factor method, and then we also have component performance alternative. So the one that typically gets utilized if you're not going comm check is the R value option. This is probably the most straightforward, right? You tell me what to do, I'm going to do it approach. There's no specific report required demonstrating compliance with the thermal envelope. Everything should be placed on those plans. But what I will say, even if you go with this compliance path, one of the best tools you could use is submitting a comm check for your mechanical, your interior lighting compliance, and your exterior lighting compliance, because it's a much easier report to read. If I get a mechanical comm check, I can look at all of these items that are on there and knock off sections that I don't have to review because it's telling me it passes. So it's a really easy it's not necessarily easy, although I showed people in Colorado last week how to work within ComCheck. It still gives you a lot of information in there. Now you got to comply with C401 through C406 in this. That's your additional efficiency packages. And then you also have to comply with C408, which is commissioning. Now, not every project is required to have commissioning. For the mechanical and service water heating, every project is required to have commissioning for functional testing of your controls of your lighting. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But that is required for the R value, the U factor, C factor, F factor option, yes. Well, when it comes to the commercial side, typically the architect designer does the thermal envelope, the mechanical contractor does the mechanical, whoever's doing the electrical does the interior and exterior lighting. When it comes to the residential side, as far as ResCheck goes, ResCheck, anybody can submit that. Now for the ERI, which is the non-proprietary version of hers, and for the performance path, those are specifically called out that it needs to be a third party that's doing it. So, yes and no, depending to which software. All right, so U factor, C factor, F factor option, this is where you're taking the values of the assembly. So if you like math, this is the compliance path for you. Because you get to decide, well, you don't get to decide, it's already established, but you get to take the assembly and say, okay, my air film, which is your paint on the exterior wall, gets this, the sheathing gets this, the continuous insulation gets this, the cavity gets this, the stud gets this, the gypboard gets this, the paint on the interior gets this. You get to add it all together, do the inverse while you add it all together, figure out your framing factor, then do a little bit more math, and then you get to do the inverse and get the U factor or the C factor or the F factor, depending on what assembly it is. And at that point, then you get to demonstrate that whatever number you come up with, as long as it's lower than what's in the table, we call it good. But there is documentation that's required with that. If you choose to go with this pathway, you then have to submit where you got your values from. So that could be from ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix A, has all those values, well, most of the values that we typically use in there. Or you can, another acceptable source is ASHRAE's Book of Fundamentals. But 90.1 Appendix A, you can go on to IECC's digital codes and look at it for free, whereas I don't believe ASHRAE Book of Fundamentals is available to look at for free. So I would suggest if you have it and you're going to use it, go with Appendix A of 90.1. A lot of people say, well, why would I go through all that hassle of doing all of this when I have the option of like ComCheck or something else? Anybody know when ComCheck actually was permitted to be utilized in the code? What edition of code? It didn't come in as a viable option until the 2015 edition. So prior to that, when you submitted a ComCheck, basically what that was an alternative method, means, and material that you didn't have to go through the process, because most code officials would much rather get a ComCheck than have to go through and verify, per table and everything with it. So it was just a readily recognized alternative. But in the 15, it's in there, now we have it. But prior to that, this was the compliance path that gave you some ability to include a lot of things to try to get to those numbers. So this one, other than the documentation of where you got everything, it's all on the plans. It is fairly straightforward like the other one. Tell me what to do, I'm going to do it. And then you're going to comply with the additional efficiency requirements and commissioning as they are applicable to your project. So, component performance alternative, this is our ComCheck. In this scenario, basically what they're doing, it's a twin building concept. So they're taking the values out of the U factor table. This is your standard reference design building. Then you get to put in the values that you want to do for your thermal envelope. And as long as what you want to do is equal to or less than what is in the standard reference design, it says you're good, which works. And it does all the math for you. So in this one, you would provide a report showing that you meet compliance with it. Again, everything should match. Whatever is in that report should also match on the plans. I just had a half-hour conversation with a code official that had received a comm check and they weren't passing. And so they just did, the comm check and never changed the plans. They're like, but I gave you a comm check. It shows that it works. And he's like, but you didn't change the plans. But you just asked for a comm check. So just make sure everything matches. So we don't have to have that kind of conversation. You still have to comply with 406, which is the additional efficiency requirements. You also have the fun of commissioning as it applies to your project. Now, this is our performance option. This is where you're doing that energy modeling to what you would like to do. Again, it's that twin concept. You have your standard reference design. There's a table that says this is what you must place in that software as your standard reference design. And then it says this is what you put in for what you want to do, whether it's proposed or it has to be what the reference design is. So there's a table that lets you know. There's an example of it on the screen. One thing I forgot to bring up earlier is prior to the 21, we used to have sections that had the notation of being mandatory, right? Had the little parentheses, mandatory. Way back when, it also had parentheses, prescriptive. In the 21, the notation of mandatory went away. So the idea is basically if it applies to your project, it's required. But when you go into C407, you're only following C407. So what they did is they created a table, and that table contains all the sections that used to be called out as mandatory. So you still have to comply with the mandatory sections that have always been mandatory. Now it's just listed in a table. You're going to do commissioning. You don't have to do the additional efficiency requirements. Anybody know why you don't have to do the additional efficiency requirements? I'm glad I asked it. I was hoping somebody could let me know.
Because they can verify with the res check or com check?
Actually, I like your thinking. But what they do have is you have to demonstrate that your project, it says 80, it should be 85% of what the annual energy cost is for the standard reference design. So basically, you have to demonstrate that whatever you're choosing to do in that project is 15% better than if it was done through the standard reference design. So that is equating to not having to do the additional efficiency requirements. They do try very hard to make sure that each compliance path is as equal as, humanly possible. So that was their solution. You don't have to do the additional efficiencies. You just have to demonstrate that you're 15% better than code. Now 90.1, I put this in here just to make sure everybody is aware of it. If you choose to go with 90.1, it's an all or nothing situation. You then don't look at anything within the IECC. You follow everything that's in ASHRAE 90.1. In the past, ASHRAE 90.1 was more stringent than in the IECC. But what it had, as far as the stringency, really, the IECC focused on like simple mechanical systems. It didn't have the provisions within it to handle complex mechanical systems. So typically the mechanical engineer was the one that determined whether you were going ASHRAE or you were going IECC. Now they're comparable. There are sections that the IECC is much more stringent than 90.1, and then there are times that 90.1 is more stringent than the IECC. So now they're one and the same, so it's kind of fallen back on the designers. What do you want to do with the project? Do you want to do it to the IECC or do you want to do it to 90.1? Most of the time they're like, ooh, we definitely want to go IECC because there's some things in 90.1 I don't want to deal with. So in this one, again, all or nothing, then we don't have to worry about it. All right, let's talk about our thermal envelope. In 103.2.1, my favorite section, it does state that you have to depict the location of where your thermal envelope is going to be. So if we looked at this, I look at it, my first few things that come to mind really, there we go, is, okay, so what's our roof insulation? All right, it's an attic. But on the plans, in the wall detail section, it showed an attic roof, but it also showed a roof for insulation entirely above roof deck, but there was no insulation entirely above roof deck anywhere within that project. So, more is not always better, because I spent a lot of time trying to find where that roof detail was going into. The other thing is, I'm looking at the above grade walls. Because we're dealing with a multifamily project, I then am thinking, is this wood or is this going to be metal, right? Below grade walls, do we have some below grade walls? Oh, I forgot this doesn't work on TV screens. Absolutely. We have some below grade walls, so I'm going to pay attention to what's going on there. Floors. There may be instances where we have a cantilevered floor, so I would have to pay attention to it. So when we look at this design on the screen there, is this a commercial project or a residential project?
Residential. No, parking garage still counts as story.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So here's the thing. This is where the energy code, you would be right if we were talking IBC, absolutely all day long. Energy code doesn't care about podium construction. So where the IBC makes that 2 buildings, the energy code says, nope, it's 1. So it's 4 stories. Now, the other thing is, when I look at this, and I'm so glad, thank you so much, appreciate it. When you look at this, there are parts of that bottom section that are above grade, and then there are parts that are below grade. So does it quantify now that it's a 4-story building, so it should stay over on the commercial side, or is it a 3-story building that we need kicked to the residential side? Aren't you glad you came today and I made you start thinking so early in the afternoon? Typically, because the code always says whatever is more restrictive is what we have to follow. But if we go into the IBC, there's a definition about how we determine a story, right? And a story above grade. It gets to the point of when you're 6 feet 8 inches, distance before when you get there, if it's over 50%, I can't remember the definition now that I was going to tell you it. And at that point, it's considered to be a story. Guess what? This bottom level, even though in some areas it was below grade, there was enough of it above grade that made it into a 4-story building. But if it was completely below grade where the parking garage was underground, we wouldn't be looking at it on the commercial side, we'd be looking at it on the residential side.
So it depends on the volume above grade.
Yes, yeah. I wish it was just straightforward. It would make it a lot easier. But this is some of the fun things that we get to figure out. And for all of my designers on this, I would say if you're wanting to go on the commercial side of things, definitely demonstrate how this is going to be a 4-story. If you're really thinking that it's going to be residential, make sure you put the information in there, especially your code analysis is going to be your biggest tool in here when it comes to energy compliance. is specifying I don't meet the definition per the IBC for it to be considered as a story, so it becomes a residential building. All right, now floors, we're going to see that there's insulation in those floors, but this is one of those times that that insulation is there because we have to have horizontal separation because we've got our occupancies up there, right? So that insulation, I'm not going to pay attention to because that insulation is not part of the thermal envelope unless I'm looking at that parking garage and whether or not that parking garage is conditioned. If it's conditioned, then I don't care about that insulation going on in that floor. If it's not conditioned, now I pay attention to the insulation in the floor, at least for the energy code. I pay attention to it for the IBC, don't get me wrong. Just as far as energy goes, then I don't care. Now, on top of that, because of where the entries and the slab and everything, there was actually portions of that structure that was going to be required to have slab-on-grade insulation. So they would have to have sections that contain that slab-on-edge insulation. It doesn't have to be for the entirety of the building. And once you're more than 24 inches, you're not required to do it, so you don't have to do it. So here's a fun one. Now that we've talked about all this, if you look at this, is this a continuous thermal envelope? Are you able to trace it with your finger without lifting your finger because there's a break? How many of you say this is a complete thermal envelope? Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you say it is not a complete thermal envelope? Raise your hand. How many of you are not sure and would like for Hope to give the answer? Raise your hand. All right, I like it. Honesty, remember, safe space. All right, well, it is not a complete thermal envelope because right here, they didn't extend that wall insulation down into that plenum. So because of that, it is not a continuous thermal envelope. And I can't tell you how many times I come across that on a set of plans. It's just little things. It's not like they weren't trying to do it. They were doing a really good job until I got to this one section and I'm like, oh man. But it's a great learning experience. Yeah, don't pay attention to the floor. That doesn't matter. Okay, so here is a test for you. Insulation is put into assemblies for a few reasons. Why do we put insulation into the assembly? Shout it out.
Sound.
Sound, absolutely. What else?
Air barrier.
Could be part of the air barrier, absolutely.
It's pretty.
Well, not always. I could show you some pictures. I might even have a picture in there that you're going to be like, no. It's actually quite funny when we get to it. I'll tell you the story behind it, and you'll be like, if I didn't have the picture, I bet they would all think that, like, Hope's making up a story. Nope, I got the picture. What else? Why else would we put insulation into a wall or a roof, floor?
Fire resistance.
Fire, there we go. We got sound, we got fire. Could be part of the air barrier. How about vapor? Yep. Yep. So these, you guys hit upon, and somebody always says air barrier, and I keep forgetting to add that in there. I got to remember to add that in there. But yes, an air barrier could be it because it is part of a system, and it could be included in them. We need to know it. So we have to know what our insulation materials are going to be, because as you can see on the screen, they have a vast range of what their R value per inch actually is. So we go all the way down from a 2.2 per inch for blown-in fiberglass all the way up to a 7.2 for polyiso. So here's a question for you. When you see on a set of plans rigid insulation, which one of these are the rigid insulation? Yep. EPS is one. XPS is one. Polyiso. There's another one. No, not cellulose blown in, but spray foam. There's 4 different categories of spray foam. We've got low density, that's our open cell. We've got mid density, that's our closed cell. We have high density, and that's typically placed, I mean, it can be used on the exterior, but it's typically used above roof deck. It's another one, that's considered a rigid insulation. There's also, rock wool. Rock wool has an insulation that's considered rigid. There is such a vast amount of insulation out there that's considered rigid insulation. We need to know exactly which one it is. Because, like polyiso, if it just said polyiso, all right. If it's just polyiso without foil face on it, it can't be considered as an air barrier. So you might have knocked it out of potentially one material taking care of all these different requirements.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So for polyiso, for air barriers, for a material that's already deemed to comply, it has to have foil facing to it. That's one of the materials that are in that 16-item list that's already deemed to comply with meeting the air permeability. All right, so now that we're going to kind of jump into the thermal envelope, since this is an overview class, I didn't put in all of the amendments because I started looking at it and I thought, okay, I think we'll make it more confusing in this overall arching of it. When we do our later trainings where we're diving into a single topic, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of all of the amendments that are to it. So out of the ones that we see on the screen here, predominantly, how many of you work primarily or predominantly in Garfield County? Okay. How about Carbondale? Okay. Glenwood Springs? Okay. Newcastle? Silt? Okay. The city of Eagle. You just do it because it has Eagle in it. Eagle County. All right. Aspen. Okay. Pitkin County. All right, so we have somebody in here for all of these jurisdictions. So what you can see here as far as our R value table, there's not a lot of jurisdictions that have amended that table on the commercial side, because we're just talking commercial right now. So, but Aspen did amend it. So here is what the typical table would look like as far as the requirements that we would need to have for our thermal envelope. This is for climate zone 6 and 7. And then this is what Aspen changed to. There are some, everything in blue is what they changed, which I'm sure all of you who work in Aspen are like, yeah, that's old hat, I get it. I'm used to it now. All right, so some of the things, obviously we aren't getting into every single section of the code, but I wanted to bring up some of the changes that had happened and some of the things that are really gonna have an impact on projects. One is our tapered insulation for our above deck insulation or roof insulation. And I bring it up because the reality is the IBC tells us, hey, you know what? We want you to put scuppers, roof drains, whatever, because we want to get the water off the roof. Well, the energy code says, heck yeah, we also want to get that water off the roof, but we also want to ensure that you are not, diminishing the insulation for that thermal envelope, because there are two areas of a building that have a huge impact on those heating and cooling loads. One is the glazing, the fenestration that's in the building, and the roof. So we do want to make sure that it has it. So what it tells us here is basically you're going to do an area weighted average of the roof. So if we come back here, and let's say we have to have an R35 continuous insulation. That has to be maintained as the area weighted average. That means to start off with, you're going to start with at least an R40 or an R45, so that when the area weighted average happens, you are maintaining that when everything is tapered, you're still at an average of an R35. Now, I have, and it does kind of depend on the roof. If the roof has 400 drains on it, then this doesn't necessarily work. But if it's a roof that has, a reasonable amount of drains to it, if the requirement was an R35, and on the plans it said that I'm going to install an R40 tapered with an area weighted average of an R30, with my experience, I'm like, it's good. I don't need all the math. But there may be instances where you get to do all the math, where I have 400 square feet that's going to have the R40, I've got 50 square feet that's going to have an R20, and you have to do all of that fun stuff and then demonstrate with that design you get to that R35. But I think if you were to start off with that R40, and again, not going crazy with the amount of roof drains that you're going to have on there, in my world, that meets the intent, and you're meeting that without having to go through the headache, unless you really like math and you want to do all that math. By all means, knock yourself out. Just I don't know very many people who think math's a lot of fun, so I like to provide, here's a way to get around all that math. Any questions about that? Because you guys got really quiet and thoughtful on what I said. All right, so here's fun. Here's an example of where, I forgot this doesn't work. You can see where the amount of tapering that's going on there. You can see the taper, but it's not crazy amount of taper on it. So that one is going to very easily be able to maintain that R35 average if it went to an R40 to start with. But if you do that, be aware that you're going to have to place the information on the plans saying, I'm starting with an R40. It's going to have an area weighted average of 35 for tapering. And then in ComCheck, because you're saying that your area weighted average is a 35, you need to put in ComCheck that the R value of that roof is going to be an R35, and then there's a little box that you click on, and you can put a note saying starting off with R40, tapered, area weighted average of a 35. That way the plans examiner knows, okay, there's not a discrepancy between what's on the plans and what's in ComCheck. They're actually saying the same thing, but they understand that you have to have the 35 value and not the 40 value, because you don't have 40 all the way around the roof. You basically have an average of 35, and that's what needs to be placed in ComCheck. All right. Joints and staggering. You are required to have multiple layers. You have to have a minimum of 2 layers when you have insulation entirely above roof deck. Those joints and seams have to be staggered, and they have to be sealed however the manufacturer says that they need to be done. Now, the only time that you have that exception is when you're dealing with, basically dealing with what we just talked about, those roof drains and so forth, where you're tapering it down. They're not saying, hey, you're tapering it down. Now you got to figure out how to taper 2 layers. If you tapered it down and you were tapered down to 1 layer at that spot, that's the exception. Like, hey, we get it. Taper away, do what you need to do, because the energy code doesn't want water on the roof either. So here's some examples. In this one, it's really hard to see, so I'm just going to talk about it. It didn't give us the R value. It did tell us that we have 3 layers of thermal insulation. Each of them are 2 inches thick, staggered overlaps. It doesn't give us the R value. It also doesn't give us what the material is. It just says, what was it, thermal insulation. 2 inches of thermal insulation. So 2 inches of batt insulation, 2 inches of blown-in insulation, right? I mean, realistically, it's probably not going to be 2 layers of blown-in insulation, but we do need to do that. It could be 2 layers of rock wool. So there's a lot that we got to make sure that we're getting on the plans. This one says it's a 5-inch rigid insulation. And then on top of that, they provided this nice little table that at least told me that the roof insulation was going to be an R25 continuous that was 5 inches. It's a little bit closer. We got that R value, but we didn't get what type of rigid insulation it's going to be. All right, and it didn't have 2 layers. So if we look at the image here, I hope you guys can see it in the back real well. Would you call this staggered? Yeah, it's staggered. I don't have a little thing, but if you notice the edge of this insulation, except for this one little mark there, but even then it was about that far. The other seam is right here, so there was a good distance, and so I would call it staggered. Would you call this staggered? All right, so where in the code does it say how much it has to be staggered? It doesn't. It's a judgment call, but what it does say is that you have to install it per the manufacturer's installation instructions. A lot of times the manufacturer's installation instructions will have a distance of, how much it needs to be staggered. If it's staggered, it has to be 2 inches, whatever the case may be. But in this instance, like, I know it's really hard to see from the angle that we were taking the picture, but it basically was this much. That is not meeting the intent of what that section is trying to say, so they did fail for not staggering it enough for that one. All right, let's talk about metal buildings. How many of you work with metal buildings? All right. How many of you love working with metal buildings and think it's so much fun trying to figure out the thermal envelope for a metal building? What? No hands? All right, I'm going to make this hopefully easier and helpful for you. So do you guys use the R value for it, or are you guys using the U factor for your metal buildings? Or both? Just kind of whatever works.
We use R.
You use R, okay. Well, here we go. So if you're using the R value, it basically says you have to have an R19 plus an R11 liner system. Aspen did change that. I think it's R35 and 20, or 19, but theirs is a little bit stronger. But more importantly, what I want to bring up is footnote B. Remember, footnotes in a table are either your friend or your foe. They're your friend because a lot of times it gives you leniency in a requirement, or it gives you a little bit further clarity about what they're trying to ask for, or it becomes your foe because you didn't look at it, and then it changes a lot of things for you. So footnote B basically says if you do not put a thermal spacer in your design for your metal buildings, then you have to go out of the R value table and go with the U factor table, which is that fun math that gets to happen. So just be aware. Here's a thermal spacer, thermal block. I get them called out a lot of different ways. So here's an example on a set of plans of where they provided it. And so they could continue using that R value table. Now, yes, this says climate zone 3, but I don't care about what climate zone it is. What we're going to look at is what a liner system is. So a liner system has very specific criteria of what you're going to do. So basically, one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to have a vapor retarder. It's going to be located below the purlins. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to have insulation between the purlins. And then because we are required to have a multi-layer system here, we're going to have insulation that goes over the purlins. So we got it going through the purlins, we got it going over the purlins, and we got a vapor retarder underneath that, underneath the purlins. So if we look at this system here, this install of the vapor retarder, does this meet the requirement of the code? I see a no. Why do you say no? Yep. They wove it up and over. And honestly, I've seen that a lot. It's not uncommon. Because the liner system is not very well known, right? So they're thinking about we're trying to protect that insulation and not understanding we're trying to protect below that whole system. So that one is not correct. This one, it's calling out for an R value system, but it doesn't have a thermal spacer included in it. So this would kick it back over to the U factor table. Remember that metal buildings are not the same as metal studs. You can have a building with metal studs. A metal building is going to have metal superstructure, and then it's going to have a metal skin with it. And typically we have girts and purlins involved. That's typically what we have. Those pre-engineered metal buildings get to have fun with this. All right, let's talk about our floors. So floors are required to have the insulation in constant contact with the underside of the subfloor, but there is an exception in there that basically says the insulation can rest on top of the, if you had continuous insulation underneath it, as long as you extend that above grade wall insulation into that floor cavity so we don't have a break. Like what we saw before, if they had extended that above grade wall into that plenum and then had the floor insulation below it, it would have been good. Now the other thing is too that for mass floors, and it might be on a different slide, but for mass floors, you do get a 1-inch gap from where the mass floor is and where the insulation goes. Slab on grade. Slab on grade, as long as the insulation is, or I'm sorry, the slab is 24 inches or less below grade, you are required to have slab edge insulation. Now it always has to start from the top of slab, or at least at the top of slab. You can't have a break in your thermal envelope, but it's got to start at least at the top of slab and extend down for the distance, or it can go from top of slab, bottom slab, under slab, or top of slab, extend down and then away from the foundation. And then the other thing is, when you have a heated slab, you're required to have that insulation all throughout the entirety underneath that slab. It's got to be at least an R5 on there. I can't remember if Aspen amended that or not, but it does have to at least be an R5 or whatever the amendment says for it. Now, it doesn't say it in the 21, but they clarify it in the 24, so I'm just going to throw it out there. You are required to have it completely under the slab continuously, with the exception that we understand that there's going to be structural columns and penetrations that may come up through the slab. It's not required to have slab edge or continuous slab insulation at the column. Obviously, you're going to have it everywhere around the column and everywhere around the penetration, but apparently that was a big deal, so they clarified that. I'm just going to let you all know that was always the intent. Obviously, a structural column, we kind of want to make sure that the structure is standing. Otherwise, it doesn't do us any good to have slab edge insulation or under slab insulation if there's no building for it to be there. So just FYI, the good news is on the commercial side, if for some reason you had a slab and the requirement was 4 feet that it had to go down, on the commercial side, you only have to do it to the top of the footing. So if it ended up being 36 inches of a foundation wall, then you would only go to 36 inches to wherever the top of the footing is. So here are some configurations that are permitted on the commercial side for slab edge insulation. As you can see, the bottom one is how you would deal with heated floors. Now, the one thing I will tell you is when you have a heated floor, you don't have to go down below your slab edge insulation. It doesn't have to go where it says it's got to be 4 feet. It doesn't have to be 4 feet when it comes to heated slab. If your heated slab is only 24 inches below grade, then what you're going to do is go from the top of the foundation, go down to where the bottom of the slab is and stop there, even if it is only 2 feet into it. So you don't have to extend it down for the remainder of the 4 feet. So here's an example that I like to bring up because it doesn't specify that it has to all be on the outside or all on the inside. Here is an example with this design because a lot of times what determines where you're going to place that insulation is what's going on structurally. Do we need that friction going on between the wall and the slab to stay there? And so you can't use it as your control joint there, so you throw it on the outside. Well, in this instance, they put portion of it on the outside and then the remainder starting from the bottom of the slab and extending down. And that is perfectly okay because it does overlap a little bit there. And then this was the design out in the field.
Does that overlap what makes it convenient?
It does, because if you think about it, when we do a thermal envelope, we're not always, it's not always in the cavity, because then we get up to the roof and it might be above roof deck, but we do, make sure that the continuity is still going on there. So the overlapping is really, if it didn't have to be this dramatic, but because they were starting it from right under where the slab was and extending it down, it just overlapped like their design with that ledge. That's just how it worked. But I would want to see, I don't want to see here, it stop here and then pick up down here where there's a question. I would want a little bit of an overlap on it. All right, skylights. How many of you put skylights into your projects? All right. Skylights will never go away out of the energy code, I'm telling you. Well, skylights are required if you have a ceiling height, the roof height, that's at least 15 feet high for at least 75% of the roof area, and it's only allowed, or not allowed, it's only required in certain occupancies as long as those occupancies are at least 2,500 square feet. So here are all the ones. My favorite one is the convention center because I attend a lot of code hearings and they're at convention centers. And when you're stuck in a room from 6 in the morning until, I don't know, midnight, 1 o'clock at night, and going back there. You don't really see the sun all that often, but you get to have a break. And when you're walking out into the, convention area, the open areas, and they have skylights going on, it's like, oh, it feels really happy before you have to go back and, battle codes. So it is very nice. I will say I'm glad convention centers are in there, because I've been in some that it's like a cave, and you're there for 2 weeks, and then you go outside and you're like, the sun is killing me. Anyway, so these are the areas that would have to have skylights. Anybody have issues with skylights?
They just kill our locales.
They can, absolutely. They can, because as you can see here, for skylights, why does this 4 and 5, that's the wrong one. But as you can see for skylights, the U factor and solar heat gain coefficient, those numbers are really high. And roofs, like I said, have a big impact on heating and cooling loads. And so because they don't have really good skylights, it does really affect it. I don't disagree with you on that at all, but it is getting better, and slowly but surely. They aren't really moving, because it's all, industry driven. Can they do that? Because you can say, hey, I want a 0.15 window, but if they don't make a 0.15 window, what are you going to do? Then they can't pass the code. The building can't be occupied because you had an unrealistic expectation. So, yeah, so here are the changes that Aspen did do for the U factor, or for the windows.
Is that just commercial or is that residential?
No, that's just commercial. We're just talking commercial. Residential, there were additional amendments there, and I believe Pitkin County had amendments for the residential side too. So we'll see those also. All right. So as you can see over here, anybody know what PF is? And it's not PF Chang's. You were going to say that, weren't you? Projection factor. So the projection factor actually will dictate what solar heat gain coefficient requirement there is. So when we come here, this is how we figure out a projection factor. How many have done the math on projection factors and have done that? How many of you just take what the most restrictive thing is in the design and just call that out? You can raise your hand, it's all good. There's nothing wrong with that. So to determine a projection factor, you actually take H and divide by V. So you're going to measure from the edge of the glazing all the way out to the edge of the overhang, whatever it is, whether it's an overhang, patio cover, whatever. You're going to measure that distance. That is your H. Then you're going to go from the bottom of the glazing and measure it to the underside of that overhang. So if our H was 15 and our V was 66, what's our projection factor? You guys thought you were going to get away and not have to do any math today. No? If you were to divide 15 by 66, what is that? There we go. There's our projection factor. Our projection factor is 0.22. So if we come back to this table, we're looking at that middle row. That means I have to have a solar heat gain coefficient of 0.48 or 0.43, depending on whether it's a fixed or operable. Now the other thing is, oops, going the wrong direction. That's because this was one big window. If we were over here, like this part from here to that first overhang there, that's one projection factor. Then we go from the bottom of that one to the underside of the other one. That's our second projection factor. So every time we have that and different levels, you have a different projection factor that would be required. So this is where it may behoove you, depending on, you know, what you have to get and cost-wise, maybe you go with the most restrictive and make life easy that every window just has to have this solar heat gain coefficient. But, yeah, absolutely.
On that one, you would take into account the height of the bottom of that roof, but you wouldn't take into account the top a little bit if the window didn't go all the way to the top.
No, because it's the underside of it that you measure to. Great question. All right. The other thing that we need is we actually have to have an NFRC certificate submitted to us at plan review. How many of you buy your windows before your plans are approved? Yeah. I agree, because chances are there's always something that comes up and you got to change a window, change its location, change the size, what have you. You don't get that NFRC certificate until you buy the windows. So it becomes this hamster wheel about what do I do for that? Well, what you do is at plan submittal, provide the plans examiner with a compliance certificate from the framing manufacturer, because they'll have it fairly dialed in as to this glass with this assembly, you know, can give you this U factor to it. And that's all I ask for at plan review. But if I go out and do your inspection, I better have that NFRC certificate so I can go have fun playing. What's that number saying there on that window? That lovely, I love those big old tickets that they put, that white ticket, and then the lettering is like this small for this big old ticket that's out there. I like the residential ones that says, hey, not everybody has a 20/20 vision, so we're going to make the numbers really big.
And they're still there 5 years later.
Yeah. All right, so that was a brief overview of the thermal envelope, hitting the highlights, obviously not everything, but let's go ahead and talk about air barriers. So in the 21, the air leakage section got very extensive. So you have two options. You can go prescriptive, which is basically you're going to comply with all of these sections that are listed up there, 5.2.1 all the way through 5.2 or 4.2.5.11.1. Say that fast, don't ya? Or you can test. But in the 21, it says, yeah, you can do that, but guess what? If you comply with 402.5.1, it kicks you out to over here. And then it says, hey, you got to comply with sections 502. That should say 511 and 512, unless you happen to be in 2B, which none of us are 2B, right? Or not to be. See, you know what? I say that one and nobody gets it. They just stand there. So I really had to control myself by not saying that. And I'm really glad you guys picked up the slack for me. That was wonderful. All right. So the first part of this section tells us if you are a Group R or Group I occupancy, you have to comply with C402.5.2. So let's take a look at what that section says. Oh, looky there. You're doing blower door testing. So in this particular instance, it's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to test to one of the three options in there. We're probably fairly familiar with 380. The other two are very familiar on the commercial side because that's been the testing mechanism for or standard forever and a day. In the commercial side, they utilize a more building-friendly testing metric, which is the CFM per square foot, because ACH is heavily dependent on volume. So if you have a large house, that's great. It works out wonderfully. But if you have a multifamily where you don't have the volume, it dings you quite a bit, and it's very difficult to pass. On the commercial side, they've always used the CFM per square foot that kind of, equalizes everything. So now, if you're a Group R or Group I, you have to demonstrate that you do not have an air leakage rate that exceeds 0.3. Now, what the...
You're saying 5 pascals, I thought all that.
No, it's at 50. Oh,
That's wrong.
no, it's 50 pascals.
I thought it was 25.
No, it's 50 pascals. That's my bad. My 0 did not make it in there. That actually equates to about 5 air changes an hour. You do have to do an unguarded test. That means it's 1 unit on test. You aren't going to have this unit on, and this unit on, and this unit on, and this unit on, and this unit on to test this one. It is only this one that's permitted to be on test. And then it also says if you have 7 or less units, you're going to test them all. If you have more than 7, then what you're going to do is you're going to test at least 7 units until you get to 20%, and where 20% of the units is more than 7. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a break that essentially you won't have to test every single unit. Now, when you put it on test, there are some parameters for it. You have to have one that's located on the top floor, one that's located on the ground floor, and you also have to do the largest unit. After that, the other 4 or however many you have to do is whichever ones you want to do. But the one thing I will let you know, for every 1 unit that fails, you will test 2 more units. So obviously it's probably a good idea to, pass the test. So the next one is buildings that happen to be not Group R or Group I, unless you fall under one of the couple of exceptions, which guess what? None of the buildings up here fall under those exceptions, which is why I didn't throw that slide in there. I didn't want to give you false hope. You get the real hope today. You can see these are the testing standards that are going to be on there. In this particular instance, it's saying that you cannot exceed 0.4 CFM per square foot when you are testing. You do get the ability of doing that area weighted average of it, which is wonderful because you are going to put the following areas on test, everything that's under a roof. So if you have, the rectangle box, obviously everything on the top floor, but if you have rectangle box and a little offshoot here, guess what? This is going under test, and this is going under test because it's also under roof. The next one is you're going to do everything that or a level that has a building entrance, cargo doors, or not cargo doors, cargo doors, loading dock, or if you have a floor that's below grade. All of that will have to be under test. And then whatever amount of area is left, 25% of it has to go under test. Now, just like the other one, it gives you kind of a, let me get you out of jail free card, kind of. If you happen to exceed the 0.4 CFM, but you're less than 0.6 CFM, they're kind of giving you a prescriptive fix. What you're going to do is you're going to put it back on test. You're going to see where the air leakage rate or the air leakage problems are. You're going to fix them. Then what you're going to do is provide a report to the building owner and to the building official, but you don't have to put the whole building back on test and test again. But if you exceed the 0.6, then all bets are off. Then you are going to have to do a full-blown test and try to figure all of that out. Make sense? Now, if for some reason a project were to fall out of the requirements, they met the exceptions for a Group R, Group I, or a non-Group R, Group I, at that point, then you're going to have to follow this. This is basically doing thermal envelope commissioning. And what's going to happen is either a third party that's not associated with the project, a registered design professional, an approved agency, or the code official can take it on. And what'll happen is a review is going to happen of your air barrier system. It's going to be documented what the deficiencies are, how it's fixed. Then there's going to be inspections that happen out in the field periodically to verify things. They're going to document deficiencies in the air barrier in the field, how they were fixed, and then a report's going to be provided. It's going to be given to the building owner and also the building official.
That's if you can't pass the blower door test?
That's only if you met one of the exceptions. With a group R, group I think for a group R or group I, there might be an instance for climate zones 6 and 7, but for buildings that aren't group R or group I, there is no exception for it. They will have to test in these climate zones.
So now you were saying third party, like on that, I had the aero barrier equipment, which gives you a certificate when complete. How would that work? We wouldn't be considered third party if we did the aero barrier and issue a certificate.
That would be something that, because remember it says an approved agency, so it would have to be approved by the code official. So in that instance, what I would do is have the conversation with the code official and ask them if they are going to approve it, because it's all reliant on them. All right, now, no matter what, air barriers, we do have to make sure that they follow all of this. So we have to make sure that it's a continuous air barrier, no matter where it's going. We have to make sure that we seal up all the joints and seams of the air barrier. We have to ensure that whatever happens, that it's not going to get dislodged. We also have to take into account things like pressure that's going to come from wind, stack effect, ventilation. Oh my gosh. And by the way, tape doesn't work. Well, I shouldn't say that. Packing tape doesn't work. Let me rephrase that, because there is tape that works. I just saw another one that used maybe it's not packing tape, but in my brain I look at it and I'm like, it's packing tape and it's pulling off, and you just called me out for an inspection. I'm imagining you put it on yesterday and I came out today and it's already pulling apart. This is not going to work, right? All right, we got to seal up penetrations. So we also have to think about the type of material that we're trying to seal up. We have to ensure that it can handle, vibrations, ventilation, again, stack effect, whether it's wind or whatever the case may be. We have to ensure what's going on with it and make sure that it doesn't dislodge. Now, looking at the image on the screen, you'll see on the upper right-hand side there, we got a penetration with a flashing system. If we move over to the left, we got a flashing system, no penetration, and a penetration, no flashing system. What do you think happened there? I have missed the mark. You're kind of right. As soon as I tell the story, you'll know exactly why I say you're kind of right. I'm going to give you a hint. What kind of window is that middle window? It's operable. Yep. There is a minimum distance that exhaust and intake can be at that window. Yes?
No, nothing.
Oh, yeah. So I thought you were raising your hand like, pick me or? No. Okay. Well, I picked on you anyway. I don't pick on the front row, but I'll pick on you because you were not brave to sit in the front row. All right, yeah, so that operable window, right, because construction is so perfect. The plan showed, it being far enough away, but hello, construction, things happen. When the inspector went out to measure, it was too close. So now there's two things you have to pay attention to, because this project was going to have to do the air leakage testing. This was a multifamily project that was 21 stories high, And this issue was on each side and on multiple locations on each side. That's a lot of things to think about, because not only do you have a penetration to seal up, you also got a flashing system that, well, I mean, they're not humongous holes. These were kind of humongous holes because it had the piping that had gone through it. So, you know, all of that. That's an awful lot to try to figure out. What are you going to do with that? That becomes, hey, you better give it a call to the architect designer and see what they may have as a solution to this, right? Because it's testing, and we want to ensure that we set them up to succeed. The next part of the penetrations is dealing with fire sprinklers. Concealed fire sprinklers, if they are part, and only if they are a part of the thermal envelope, you must seal them up. Caveat is, you only can seal them up how the fire sprinkler manufacturer requires them to be sealed up. How many of you have somebody you use for your fire sprinkler designs? Okay. How many of you have seen the information from the fire sprinkler manufacturer that says how these fire sprinklers have to be sealed up? Because as you can see here, that's a big gap. That's going to cause that project to fail their blower door test. I'll tell you that. Actually, it did fail their blower door test.
Through the aero barrier, Scott, what was it, a 16th of an inch or an 1/8 inch?
What?
When we did the aero barrier certification?
It'll seal up to a 1/2 inch.
No, I think it'll,
No,
on
no,
the
for
fire
fire
sprinkler,
Oh, yeah,
it
yeah,
said,
yeah.
I think it's 16th of an inch is what
I think it was a 16th.
Well, I'll let you know, even though this is in the code, and it's been in the code since the 2015 edition of the IECC, when it got in there, Eric Hugo presented it from NFSA, National Fire Sprinkler Association, and he had said that all fire sprinklers were exempt from it. Obviously, I stood up against it, and I said, well, then you're setting a project up to fail, because they'll never pass their blower door test. And so the compromise was, okay, then they just have to seal it how the manufacturer says. I'm like, absolutely, I don't care. I just want to make sure that projects aren't setting up to fail, right? Because there's nothing worse on your side if a project fails. There's nothing worse on my side if a project fails, right? Because we have to come up with something, because if it ever came back that said, hey, you let that project move forward even though it failed, right? So none of us want to be on the news. None of us want to have any attention paid to us. We just want to keep on doing what we're doing and make life good. So there are 0 manufacturers as of this date, or last time I checked with him, that have actually put together something for that. And the reason why they haven't is because nobody's asked them for it. And their philosophy, what they keep telling Eric, is no one's asking us for it, so why are we going to do something that nobody's asking for? And I'm like, well, I guess that makes sense. I'm not going to do extra work if I don't have to do extra work, and I'm sure probably everybody else is in that same boat. So I say start asking for it, see what we get. Aero barrier may be a great option for that, but yeah.
I mean, when you're doing that blower door, wouldn't you, as a contractor, have to go through tape over those?
Well, technically they're supposed to remain as is.
But if they're arguing they're exempt, though, then, yeah, I guess that's where.
Yeah.
Yeah, ask the inspector, but.
Yeah, well, they're not exempt from it. They tried to get that into the code as such.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it didn't make it in. They're not exempt. You just have to do it however the manufacturer tells you to do it. So like if there was one that said, hey, do this, and you did this and you failed, me as a code official, this is just the world according to Hope. Okay, so it's not what every code official would agree to. But if I saw that, I saw the effort was made, I'm looking everywhere, I don't see any other issues going on, and you know, maybe you exceed the number and you do the little smoke tracer and it says, oh, it's all going through the fire sprinklers, I'm gonna say it's done. We're good. Maybe it was a little bit over. There's nothing else you can do. You did what the manufacturer says to do. Move on with life. We're good. Again, the world according to hope. Okay? I have to make sure that I make it very clear that that's what it is. All right. So air barriers for a material, it has to demonstrate that it does not leak more than 0.004 CFM per square foot at 75 pascals. You have 16 materials that are deemed to comply as long as the joints and seams are sealed. So here are the 16 materials that you can use. You got plywood, OSB as long as they're 3/8 of an inch, extruded polystyrene as long as it's at least a 1/2 inch, foiled faced or foiled backed polyiso. We were talking about that earlier. Closed cell spray foam as long as it's 1.5 inches. Open cell spray foam can be an air barrier, but it has to be 4.5 inches. Oh, I got a great picture of that one. Exterior or interior gypboard, that can be an air barrier. Cement board can be an air barrier. Roofing material, you'll see that there are 3 different types of roofing material that are considered to be an air barrier. Portland cement, gyp plaster, as long as we're at 5/8 of an inch. Cast in place or precast concrete. Fully grouted concrete block masonry. Sheet steel or aluminum. That is how metal buildings have an air barrier. That's their air barrier. Solid or hollow masonry units there. The next one is material or assemblies. We have 3 different assemblies that are already deemed to comply, again, as long as you ensure that you seal up all the joints and seams. Now, what time is it? It's 1:30. That's the end of the thermal envelope. We're going to hit mechanical and lighting. I don't know if you guys want like a 5-minute break to use the restroom, or do you want to just continue on and have a break in between commercial and residential? Obviously, this is a real high overview of mechanical, some of the probably more pertinent things in there. First is heating and cooling load calculations need to be provided. The reason we need these, it's called out in both the mechanical code and the energy code. The energy code uses those heating and cooling load calcs to determine the correct size of equipment that's going into the project. Quite honestly, a lot of people think the thermal envelope is the biggest thing for energy efficiency, but it's having the correct sized equipment that has the biggest tangible effect on energy efficiency. Now, there are a few exceptions, especially when you're dealing with like multiple units, like you have to have those backup units, data centers, or it might be a critical occupancy that not only has this unit, but has a backup unit to it to ensure that it's always running or, taken care of. And so those ones, you can still have that duplicity with it. You just have to ensure that they're not on both at the same time. Vestibules, heated or cooled. I promise by the end of the class, I may or may not be able to speak. We'll see. Heated and cooled vestibules, you can have them. There are some specific requirements. You cannot heat them more than 60 degrees. You cannot cool them more than 85 degrees. You also have to ensure that there's a thermostat in the actual vestibule itself. There's a couple of exceptions here, and this is when you're doing the site recovery energy, or when your heating and cooling are being provided by transfer air that would typically just be exhausted out. So if you're kind of reusing that air to heat or cool the system and it was just going to go outside anyway, then we're not caring about how high or how low you heat and cool the vestibule. There are off-hour controls. Now, basically what we're doing is we're ensuring that the mechanical system is on when we need it to be on and off when we need it to be off. Economizers. Economizers are incredibly important to utilize because anybody know what a economizer does for us? Gives us free air. Yeah, it's free air conditioning. So when the outside is cool enough and it's a benefit to the system, then we're bringing in that cooled air so the cooling equipment doesn't have to work so hard. And it's wonderful to have. Now, you can have choices. You can have an air side economizer. You can have a water side economizer. Doesn't matter. It is required. There are some exceptions to it that allows you to fall into it. If you go into ComCheck, and it actually lets you specify which exception you're utilizing as to why you're not putting in an economizer. But I would say maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was seeing where economizers, the exception was kicking in because there wasn't a really good understanding about what economizers do. Now, I honestly, like racking my brain, I can't recall the last time I saw a project that utilized an exception for it, because I think there's been a transition in understanding, you know, people like free, even if it is free cool air, right? Demand control ventilation. So if you have an occupancy that, or a space that has an occupant load that's 15 per, I always say this wrong, 15 per 1,000 square feet, so occupancy of 15 people. Like when you go into the IMC and you go into, you know, the table in chapter 4 that says what your occupancy per, you know, 1,000, whatever square footage it is. So if you find that you are greater than equal to 15, at that point you have to install demand control ventilation on it. And basically what it is there are dampers involved. So in this space, you have a whole lot of people there. So we want to ensure that we have ventilation going on in that area, but this spot, this room, only has one person in there, and there's no need for the ventilation to go there, so a damper closes, so it kind of saves energy in that fashion. Parking garage ventilation. So parking garages, I have a hard time with this one. The only reason I have a hard time with this one is because there is a conflict between this and what's in the IMC. So I'm going to tell you this is what the energy code says, but just make sure you take a look at what's in the IMC also. But basically what it says is you're going to ensure that you have devices on there to basically monitor the carbon monoxide and the nitrogen dioxide. You're going to have detectors going on there. You're going to ensure that there are controls that each ventilation system does not have more than 50% of the design capacity, or you're utilizing intermittently operated fans less than 20% of the occupied time, or to maintain acceptable containment levels or contaminant levels that you find within the IMC. So what I'm going to say, that's what it talks about in there. There's also provisions in there that talk about for failure of contamination sensing devices. At that point, if it's not working, it's going to kick on those exhaust fans to operate continuously. Now there is some exceptions for that, and that happens to be if the garage's total exhaust capacity is less than 8,000 CFM with the ventilation systems, and they do not utilize heating or mechanical cooling. The second one is garages that have garage area to ventilation system motor nameplate ratio that exceeds 125 CFM per horsepower and do not utilize heating or cooling, mechanical cooling in that. I always have to look at it because this was so heavily contested at the code hearings. All right. The next thing that I think is fun, and I think is fun for all of us here, because we've probably all been in a hotel room, right? Anybody been in a hotel room? Am I the only one? All right. So for hotels, R1s, If you happen to have 50 or more guest rooms, at that point, these parameters are going to kick in. You're going to have controls that are going to control your heating and cooling. They're going to control your ventilation. And you're also, in those controls, have the capability of utilizing like a key card system, right? Meaning that you walk into the room, you take your hotel key, and you just put it in the slot, and that's what makes all of this work. Now, there are 3 conditions that they need to be in. One is the first one. This happens to be if it has been rented, but it's not occupied. So we know the room's being rented. It's that in-between time before they're actually going to get there. You're going to ensure that there are controls in there that's either going to raise the temperature by 4 degrees, really depending on heating, cooling, whatever we're doing there, or it's going to lower 4 degrees. And then what you're also going to do is that the changes happen within 30 minutes of the occupants that are leaving that room. That one doesn't always make a lot of sense because it's like it's rented, but it's not occupied. Why do we need to have that? But I think they're trying to say that the set of it kicks in when the previous occupants that had rented that room have left that room because they've checked out. Which I know they can't really say that, but that's really what they were trying to do. All right, number 2, if it's not rented and not occupied, at this point, what you're going to do is you are going to ensure that it is either cooled to 80 degrees, or what you're going to do is make sure that it's heated to not more than 60 degrees. Now, in this instance, it also has the option that if you have a network guest room system. How many of you, a couple of you said that you've stayed at a hotel. Have you ever had where they ask you, what time are you going to check in? You know why they're asking you what time you're going to check in? Not because they care about whether the room is ready. Well, I mean, they do. Activates this stuff. Exactly. So if they have that system in place, you don't necessarily have to go with that. But it does have to use the set points, the required set points, and all of that happens within 60 minutes of when they were scheduled to come in. So you've seen where you walk into the hotel room and on the TV screen it says, "Hello, Hope." And things, you walk into the room, you're like, oh, it's not too bad, but you hear it kicking in and things are starting to either get cooler or heated, and that's because all of that system is kind of kicking in for it. Because it makes sense. If it's not rented, nobody's going to be there. Why does it have to be 85 degrees? Well, it doesn't, or heated to 85 degrees. The other one is if it's an occupied guest room, now what we're going to do is we're going to ensure that it has the correct set points here. Now, the next thing is when we're talking about ventilation, it's going to happen, it's going to turn off within 20 minutes of the occupants leaving the room. Now, there is an exception on there, and that happens to be that the ventilation gets to basically purge for 60 minutes when that room has been unrented. So there is a time so that, the ventilation is shut off. And so there's not a whole lot of air movement going on. So what they're saying is, okay, so now we're going to allow you to purge the system in that room so that, when people walk in, they want to continue staying with you. All right. Dampers, right? We talked about the thermal envelope. We did a really good job ensuring that, hey, we were sealing up all the joints and seams, and then we have these enormous openings to allow air in and to exhaust air out, which we want. But what we do have to have are motorized dampers unless you fall into one of the exceptions. If you happen to be 2 stories or less, you would be exempt from that. And the other one doesn't really count because we're not in climate zones 1, 2, or 3. And excuse me, the last one is if your exhaust capacity is less than 300 CFM. There is an exception in there again. Isn't required to be motorized if you happen to be climate zone 2. Climate zone 2 is apparently the special climate zone that gets a lot of exemptions out of things. Obviously, we are not. Okay, that was a very brief overview of the mechanical systems. I actually do an 8-hour class just on the mechanical section, so I was trying to pick and choose, but don't worry, we're going to do an in-depth training on a lot more than what we just talked about here briefly. So we do have that up and coming. But let's talk about some lighting. So dwelling units on the commercial side, right? So if they're 4 stories or more and they're dwelling units, at that point you have to ensure that 90% of all of the lighting is high efficacy bulbs or have high efficacy luminaires. And they have to comply. For the lamps, they have to be 65 lumens per watts, and for luminaires, they have to be 45 lumens per watts. That changed in the 21 because the federal minimum, or efficiency or definition, however you want to call it, the federal changed it, so that's why the energy code changed those two. Now, you do have an option. You can do 90%, or you can just comply with 405.24 or 405.3, which is your interior lighting compliance and your exterior lighting compliance, so you could choose to do that instead. Occupancy sensors. So as you can see, there are 12 instances or locations that occupancy sensors are required to be on there. The new addition in the 21 is corridors. Now it does state, here, basically, this section is telling us, okay, if you're a office, open plan office, you're going to comply with 405.2.13. If you are a corridor, you're going to do 0.4. And so it gives warehouses, those are 405.212. So it tells you what section you need to do. If you're not one of those, then it says, okay, so we want to ensure that those occupancy sensors are then going to basically be turned off or reduced 20 minutes after all of the occupants have left. And then if they're being reduced, it's being reduced to not more than 50%. So one thing to kind of keep in mind, a lot of times there are instances where it doesn't completely shut off. It just reduces the lighting down pretty drastically. Now, there are some exceptions for when they have to stay on fully. At this point, it talks about having automatic on controls, and it's permitted if it happens to be corridors, interior parking areas, stairwells, restrooms, locker rooms, that all the areas that we see up there where having it shut off would endanger the occupants.
What constitutes an occupant sensor? Motion and carbon dioxide, or?
It would be more of, I've seen it where sometimes they're listed as occupancy sensors where they turn on when somebody walks into a room, or they'll call them vacancy sensors when people have left and they shut off 20 minutes after they leave. So those two would probably qualify for that. As far as carbon monoxide or dioxide, they would not, typically they're not connected on that. The only time that really kind of comes into play is when we were talking about the demand ventilation requirements. Great question, though. All right. Occupancy sensors in corridors. So in corridors, they do not shut off completely. They do reduce down by at least 50% after 20 minutes of nobody being in the area. There is an exception. The exception is dealing with at the darkest portion, if it only has 2-foot candles of light on it, you don't have to put occupancy sensors on it. Anybody know why? Close. Egress egress requirements about the minimum foot candle that it has to be. So it cannot go below that, and that's why there is an exception in there for it. Warehouses, very similar, right? Reduce power by 50% within 20 minutes of everyone being there. The important thing is to understand that the big open space is independently controlled than the aisles, and each aisle is individually controlled. Aren't you glad I did this? Because if I did that, you wouldn't know what I was talking about. I'm really bad about that. Time switches. So, if a structure or a room or lighting system does not have a occupancy sensor, it will be on a time switch. That time switch is going to have the capability of being scheduled for 7 days. It's also going to have multiple times within 7 days. It's going to have the ability to incorporate holiday hours into it. So for 24 hours, we know nobody's going to be in the building because it is Hope's Day that everybody has off. So because everybody has this day off, no matter what, nobody's going to be working. So we can then program it that says, okay, for the next 24 hours, you don't have to be on. You get a break too, lighting system. Then we're also going to have an override switch because there's going to be times that maybe the schedule was like, hey, everybody wasn't supposed to work on Hope's Day off day, and somebody came into work. So there is an override switch. It's a manual control. It will allow the lights to turn on, but then it's only on for 2 hours. So they are working, but we're going to kick them out after 2 hours for it. And then that override switch does trigger it back to its normal type of scheduling. The other thing it also has in there is that it has to have backup to it, programmable. The program has to have a backup to it. So if the power was interrupted for 10 hours, that when the power comes back on, it doesn't have to be reprogrammed. It contained all of the scheduling and it just continues on with it. Parking garage lighting. This is a new one too in the 21. So now you have to have occupancy sensors, or it could be on a time switch in those garages. I would say probably occupancy sensor unless your garage is only open from 8 to 9 type of deal. Otherwise, we probably want it to be on occupancy sensors. You will then have where you reduce at least 30% of the lighting 20 minutes after it doesn't register that there's no occupancies in there. Each zone cannot be bigger than 3,600 square feet. There is an exception in there dealing with the foot handles again because we have to ensure that we aren't impeding egress with it. There is also an understanding that you don't have to follow at the entrance and exits for the eye adaptation, which that I am grateful because I don't know about you. Have you ever gone into a parking garage and it's been a bright sunny day and you go in there and you immediately, or at least I do, I put on the brakes so that my eyes can adjust because I'm like, I don't even know if I'm supposed to go down or turn or what I'm going to hit or who I'm going to hit. I don't like being on the news, Crazy lady went barreling down a parking garage. Where was I missing? Oh, guess what? It also includes daylight responsive controls now. So if you have openings in that parking garage and you have the ability where the daylighting can take care of the lighting, then you are going to have daylight responsive controls on there. Now it does have some exceptions to that. If there happen to be things like there's massive obstructions, so it wouldn't make sense to have daylight responsive controls, that would be an exception to it. Now it does talk about that openings obstructed by screens or elements to restrict daylight. So if you put up those screens, they have those, where have I seen them? Where they have the big openings, but they have these wonderful screens that are going on it that it does limit. So basically what they're saying is, you don't have to put those daylight responsive controls in that instance. Grow facilities. So grow facilities, for plants, right? When I say grow facilities, that does not mean marijuana. Can be marijuana, but I don't know about you. I've seen an awful lot of warehouses converted into tomato plant growing or lettuce leaf. I've seen lettuce leaf at the zoos. There's been zoos that are growing their own lettuce for their own animals. So they all have these lighting systems. Well, these lighting systems can't follow the same parameters for high efficacy that we would have for us as humans, because lumens are for humans. And don't laugh at me because I can't say it. This is my aluminum or spaghetti for some people, but it's okay. It's micromole per joule. Take those sounds that kind of came out of my mouth and try to put it in the correct way. I'm sorry, I try every single time and I'm like, I got to do it. One of these times I'm actually going to get it right. I practice this and I don't know. Anyway, as long as it has to have an efficiency of 1.6 per joule, then we call it good. So basically what they're doing is having the correct high efficiency that would pertain to the type of lighting that would be for to grow plants. You guys giggle, but just wait. One of these days you're going to have a spaghetti too. All right. Another thing that came into play is automatic controlled receptacles for the 21. So it means that 50% of all the receptacles have to be controlled receptacles when you happen to have an enclosed office, conference room, rooms that are used for copying or printing, break rooms, classrooms, those individual, workstations. They now all have to have 50% of them that are controlled receptacles. Now, you have some options. You can have it split where one is controlled, one isn't, or you can have two where one full control, one full uncontrolled. You can't use plug-ins. Plug-ins are not acceptable. They do have to shut off after, 20 minutes? Yep, 20 minutes of no activity being sensed. You'll have to make sure that whatever one is being controlled is marked, which I don't know why they have it in here, because the NEC also says if you have controlled receptacles, they have to be marked, and they specify all that. You also have to uniformly distribute all of those all throughout the space. You can't just make all of the controlled in one spot. And wherever you have a controlled one, you now have to have an uncontrolled one within 12 inches of it. Plug-in devices are not permitted. Now there are some exceptions. Exceptions would be for equipment that must run 24 hours, because remember it said break rooms, and I don't know about you, but I want to make sure that that refrigerator is not on a controlled receptacle. If the control would endanger the safety and security, so in my opinion, if we look at this image, that coffee pot would endanger the safety and security of those around them if I'm not going to get my coffee on time in the morning, right? I would say that if somebody presented that to me, I'd be like, sold, you got it. No controlled receptacle. Let alone the fact that I worked in an office that had controlled receptacles, and I know what the ramifications are of that. It doesn't really... I'm sure there are instances that it absolutely saves energy, so don't get me wrong on that. But what ends up happening, because I was a plans examiner at this office, so every time somebody came to the counter, I would have to go up, right? So I'm talking to them. After 20 minutes, which most of the time I'm at the counter for longer than 20 minutes, I was not very good at saving my work. It would all shut off. This is a long time ago where you didn't have that automatic saving, or at least our system did not automatically save, so I'd have to start my plan review over. So ultimately what ended up happening, because obviously the higher ups don't like the fact that I'm doing work twice, that it became, okay, so the one plug and there was only one plug that was not controlled. And it fed like 15 offices, the little workstations in that area. So we had a extension cord, strip, extension cord, strip, extension cord, strip, right? Our fire people, because we had a door, you know, a front counter and then a door that led back to where, you know, all of us were, they would not enter that door. They stopped at that door because if they didn't see it, they wouldn't have to tell us to remove it. And I think they were probably fully aware of it. But anyway, unintended consequences, but it is in the code. So it is something that we do need to follow when we happen to be one of these occupancies. All right, the next really fun part of the commercial code that we're going to bring it to a conclusion is the additional efficiency requirements. So in the past, we would just pick one and be done. Now we have to obtain 10 points for new buildings, 5 points for tenant spaces. Now remember, tenant spaces is the first tenant going into a space. After that, it becomes an alteration and it doesn't have to comply with it. But the first person going into that space has to get 5 points. All of the points are going to come out of a table. It's weighted by the occupancy of the space. It's also weighted by the climate zone. How much impact is it going to be? In most instances, you are going to be required to do more than one item to be able to get to those 10 points. So here are all of the options. We're going to go through them in a bigger detail, but this is what we have as far as options for additional efficiency. So the first one is having more efficient HVAC equipment. In this instance, you're going to demonstrate that you're either 5% better or 10% better than what we would find within the efficiency tables, right? We've got 16 tables that say this equipment has to be this SEER or, you know, whatever efficiency notation that it falls under. You have to demonstrate that it's 5% or 10% better than what the minimum would have to be. You also have some information in there if it's not listed. Variable refrigerant systems could go into 90.1 to pull what the minimum efficiencies are out of that table and then demonstrate that you're 5 or 10% better there. Because we don't have it in the IECC, it's still in ASHRAE, so it is allowing you to still do that and go there. Now, reduce lighting power density. In this one, it gives you two options. Because in the base of the code, you're allowed so many watts per square foot, and you design a building and you say, hey, we were given 1,000, we're only using 500, we're 500% better than code. I'm going to let you know, my math is not the best, so 500% may not be the correct number, but it's just showing you that it's better than code. But in this instance, you have some items on there. So if you're 10% better, then you're going to follow what point number you get out of the table per your occupancy. If you demonstrate that you designed that building and it utilizes 15% or more less than, that sounds weird, at least 15% less than what you're allotted, then you get to do an equation. So in that equation, you actually could be one and done. This is the only one that could potentially be a one and done for you. So if you, lighting power densities, it's been a really easy one to get to, an easy one to do, especially with all of the advancement that we've had in the lighting industry as far as energy efficiency goes. Now, if we can get it to 15, you can do the equation for it. Enhanced digital lighting controls. In this particular instance, as long as we're on continuous dimming, you can have up to where you're controlling 8 or less luminaires within that, the sensor that it's controlling. You do have to have a sequence of operation listed on those plans. We have to ensure that. It also is going to require that commissioning happens with those devices also. Now, the best thing is There is a jurisdiction up here that has them. I love going there. And, you know, because a lot of people don't really care for daylight lighting controls, but it's so great. I love going into his office because it's continuously dimming, so you're never like where it's either all dark or all really light. It adjusts it to the amount of light that's coming. I love it. Anyway, I know we got a lot to talk about. Solar, if you put on-site renewable energy, you can meet one of the two options and get the credits for it. The other one is if you use a DOAS system, a dedicated outdoor air system. Anybody seeing those getting installed with your projects? Yeah, this is another one of those designs, I guess you could say, or equipment, whatever you want to call it, that I'm seeing more and more of. And so if it happens to meet all the parameters here, you can then count it as additional points for your efficiency packages. Reduced water use. Now, this is only applicable for certain occupancies, and as you can see, these are water dominating use occupancies. So if you use one of the three items in there, you get to count the points for it. You can have an enhanced envelope performance. This one is not too bad depending on where you're at, right? Aspen getting 15% better might be more difficult than, you know, Garfield County. So just keep that in mind. Don't do this one. This is reduced air infiltration. This is the 0.25. I hate air infiltration in a building. So I want really tight buildings. The problem is because on the commercial side, we have not paid attention to air barriers like we should, that we want to ensure that we're setting projects up to succeed. So just like on the residential side of things, we got the opportunity back in '09 that we were doing blower door tests and we got all the way up to 7 air changes an hour, right? That was so that we could practice and try to figure out what works, what doesn't work. Then it got ratcheted down to the 3 air changes per hour. I think on the commercial side, we need to have that practice of it, because you don't want to rely on this, because what happens if you exceed the 0.25 air changes, right? What can you do at the last minute to make up those points that you would have gotten? So I think, I'm not saying forever don't do it. I'm just saying right now, unless you've been paying attention, you got really good details, really good information on the plans and everything, I say let's pick something else and let's get it figured out in the base of the code. And maybe next go around think about, that's a great idea, let's do advanced air. Energy monitoring. So energy monitoring is actually required for buildings that are 25,000 square feet or larger. I didn't go over that, but it is required. And if you choose to put it in, and it's not required out of section, what is it, 405.10.1, then you are deemed to be able to get those points. So it's when you put it in and it's not required, get some points for it. Oh, I'm sorry. Fault detection and diagnostic. So a lot of systems already have this. It's just there's nothing that on the other side to communicate with saying, hey, we're having some issues. And so you get points now when you have something on the other side that's saying, hey, we got issues going on with the system. And then efficient kitchen equipment. So this is for those A2s or anything that has like a commercial kitchen facility. And I want to make this very clear. You have to have at least one gas or electric fryer. And then you have all of your fryers, your dishwashers, your steam cookers, and ovens that they comply with the parameters that we see here. Basically, you're going to ensure that all of that equipment is high efficacy equipment for those things. So you have to have, it's not, you get to do it if you only have a fryer. It's all of those items to get those points. Now here are the tables. So as you can see for, I keep trying to point to it. So this is for a B occupancy. And if we look in climate zone 7, if it's enhanced envelope performance, you could be one and done because it's 14. You only have to get 10, remember. The other one is reduced air infiltration. You get 11 points. Again, that's a lot if we haven't been doing the testing already. But another one I would say is, reduced lighting power density. You get 7 for it. You do the calculation, you're going to be well over 10 points. Same can be said. Here is our I occupancy, our E occupancy, our M occupancy, and then all other occupancy. All right. That is the end of the commercial. So now we have residential energy. So I don't know how everybody's feeling. Do you guys want a 5-minute break or just dive on through? All right, let's just keep going. All right, so just like on the commercial side, 103.2 or R103.2 on the residential side is my favorite section because it really gives us a really good path to ensure that we can have successful projects, right? Because it has all the information that we need. Now, when we talk about compliance paths for residential, what we have is our prescriptive. And with the prescriptive path in the 2021, in the past, the very first one, the insulation and fenestration pathway was our R value. And then the U factor was the alternative. In the 21, they flopped. So the insulation and fenestration criteria one is now the U factor path, and the R value is the alternative to it. Then we have total A, total UA. Total UA is our res check. We've got our total building performance, which used to be the simulated building performance. In the 21, it changed its name. Guess what? In the 24, it goes back to simulated building performance. It was just a phase it was going through. And then we have our energy rating index, very similar to our HERS score, right? It's the energy rating index, or ERI, is the non-proprietary version of a HERS score, because the IECC, the International Code Council, really tries to be non-proprietary, so that if there is, like, maybe there's a program XYZ that falls under the parameters of ERI and it can show compliance, then we want the ability that XYZ has the same options that HERS and ERI does. Now with ERI, the options within it is whether or not it has on-site renewable, and it's included into the calculation. You can have on-site renewable that isn't included, then you're going to follow without, but otherwise, if it's included, then we're going to follow the parameters for included. All right, prescriptive, 3 options. It's very similar to what we had before. The prescriptive insulation fenestration criteria, this is our U factor option where we're doing that assembly approach. This is where we want the lower the number, the better it actually is for energy efficiency. So this is where we take everything into account. We're going to follow the parameters and ensure that whatever value that we have does not exceed the value that happens to be in R402.1.2. Now, there are some items in that table that don't exist in that table, but do exist in the R value table. That's our slab edge insulation and your solar heat gain coefficient. So ultimately what that, I'll talk about that later. So those items you would still have to go and take a look at the R value table to get what's required. It doesn't mean that it's not required. It just means it's not listed in that table, which makes it not tradable. So in this one, you're not trading anything within the thermal envelope. Everything's by the book, should be on the plans. You're going to follow 408 through 404 or 401 through 404 and 408. I'll speak English, I told you sometime today. You're going to comply with table R402.1.2, and everything's on the plans. Now, probably the one most utilized, or I shouldn't say most utilized now, but is our R value option. Now, this is the alternative to it, and basically what you're going to do is you're going to follow table R402.1.4. It's the most straightforward one, right? What is the R value supposed to be? Okay, great, that's what I'm going to do. What does the U factor have to be? Okay, great, that's what I'm going to do. Whatever it is, it's by the book. It's all on the plans. No reports required. Then we have our total UA, which is res check. Now, total UA, there are multiple softwares out there to demonstrate compliance with it. Everybody thinks about res check, right? Because res check is a free software that anybody can utilize. So a lot of times, if it's the designer putting the res check together or the energy stuff together, I'll get a res check. If you have a rater involved and you choose to go with a total UA, then I'll get a report from Ecotrope or REMrate. So all three of those softwares can be utilized for the total UA option, and all of them are acceptable. Now you are going to follow, like I said, in this one, you're going to, the values that happens for that reference design, because this, remember, is the reference design, and then here's what I want to do for the thermal envelope. The reference design values all come out of 402.1.2, the U factor table, except for the couple of items that aren't there, like you can't trade off slab edge, you can't trade off solar heat coefficient, so those values come out of this, the 402.1.3 table. But basically, as long as you show that what you want to do for your thermal envelope and what your reference design is, if it's equal to or less than for your U factor on it, you can call it good and move on with life. Now, in this one, again, you are going to comply with R408, which is the additional efficiency requirements, new on the residential side of things. Then we have our total building performance. This, again, is where we're doing some modeling. You have your standard reference design, which is everything that we're going to find out of the table. And I can't remember the table's name now. It's 402.52 parentheses 1, I believe. Or that table, you have all the values that your standard reference design is. And then it tells you how you're going to treat what your proposed is. And it lets you know what you're permitted to actually trade off in that design, and then it gives you modeling of it. And as long as what you have is equal to or less than what the standard reference design is, then you're good. Unless, well, we'll talk about that later. That's a caveat till when we get to the additional efficiency stuff. Then we got our ERI. Now, this is, again, you know, that twin concept, twin building concept. You show compliance by what number it's given. There are some requirements when it comes to the thermal envelope, but basically what happens here is you are trying to demonstrate how much better your design is compared to the prescriptive values that we found in the 2006 IECC. So that's what those numbers are. So when it says I have a score of 54, that means that, sorry, Hope's doing math real quick. She should have picked a better number. 54, that means you are 46% better than a house that was built to the prescriptive values of the 2006. So that's what those numbers are indicating. You still have to comply with the mandatory table. Both this one and prescriptive has a mandatory table that shows all the mandatory sections. In this one, we're going to make sure we get the 2 compliance reports. This is the first go around where 2 reports are required at plan review and at certificate of occupancy. And this one does have to be done by an approved third party, as we had mentioned before. All right, We have to define our thermal envelope also on the residential side. Anybody think of spaces that come into question from the residential perspective, whether they're inside or outside of the thermal envelope? Garages. Attics. What else?
What about like
Mechanical space, absolutely. Crawl space. Oh, you guys hit them all like that, which is great. Yeah, so those are all areas that I worry about or I have to pay attention to about whether they're in or out. So having this defined is incredibly important because if we saw this one here, that's really easy to tell. In this one, we've got insulation starting at the footing going all the way up the top. Then we got the roof, the little knee walls going on all the way up here. And then we come here to this floor. This floor on the left-hand side has insulation in it. And this wall where the hall and water walk-in closet are is also insulated. But we have no insulation going on here to maintain that continuous envelope. So I then ask the question, what's going on here? Because if the exterior storage and the mechanical and utility room is going to have outside combustion air coming in, then that means that this floor also would be required to have insulation in it. If that's just going to be sound, then that insulation needs to extend down at that exterior storage area. So that becomes a question I asked them. The floor was just for sound because they were worried that the mechanical equipment might make a lot of noise. So here's our bat insulation table. This actually comes from NAMA. They're the North American Manufacturer or North America Insulation Manufacturer Association. And so they have this put together that basically says, what depth of a cavity do I need to have to allow my insulation to get its R value that's listed? Because every time you compress insulation, you no longer have the R value that's marked on it, right? So here's the table. Here's climate zone 6, here's climate zone 7. This is what we would find out of the code book. Now, this is it for the jurisdictions that have amended this section. So we have a row here for Pitkin County. We have a row here for Aspen when it's a new construction or an addition. Then we have Aspen's requirements for when it is a alteration. So as you can see, they have different values than what we would have just straight out of the code. Like I said, I didn't want to, we'll dive into it deeper when we go into residential thermal envelope. But so this is why it's so incredibly important to know which compliance path you're using, because just like on the commercial side, you need to tell me which option of the prescriptive path, if you're choosing the prescriptive path, you're going to do. Because for ceilings with attics, now this one is kind of interesting. If you go with the R value option of the prescriptive path, and the code requires an R60 in that table, you can reduce it down to an R49. If you can get an R49 uncompressed up and over that top plate. It gives you an opportunity. This is flexibility that's been kind of baked into the code, so to speak. But it's only permitted if you're going with the R value option. If you're going with res check or you're going with U factor or anything else, R60 is where you're starting off with. So it's kind of nice. The other one is if you have a space that doesn't have attic space in it, you can reduce it down from that whatever value R60 or the other values that are there down to an R30. You're only allowed to do it for up to 500 square feet or 20% of the roof. It's really, whichever one is the smaller amount, right? And it's, again, only allowed if you're going with that R value option. So If you have a bump out, it's a great opportunity to only have to put in that R30 for that bump out, because typically you don't have an attic space in there. You're just dealing with those rafters in there. So it could be a viable option for it. Another one that's in here is slab edge insulation. Slab edge insulation is only required, now remember, we're not going through everything. Slab edge insulation is only required if that slab is 12 inches or less below grade. Once you go more than 12 inches, it doesn't count as slab edge insulation. Now you're looking at below grade, basement walls, crawl space, whatever the case may be for that design. Now in this instance, basically what we're going to want to ensure that, again, you're going from top of slab to the distance that's listed in the table. There is no verbiage on the residential side that says you only have to go to the top of the footing, as there is on the commercial side. So where it says 4 feet, what's your frost depth here? It depends. Anything below 4 feet? No? Oh, okay. So for you all, I guess it's not that big of a deal. When you get down into the lower climate zones where they're dealing with like 36 inches and they got to do 4 feet of insulation, it becomes a creative design for that. So in this one, again, if you have heated slab, remember everything underneath that slab has to have that R5 insulation to it. And this one is not tradable because it's not in the U factor table, it's only in the R value table. So that means you can't trade it in ResCheck. So here are the configurations you have. It's very similar to what we saw on the commercial side with the addition of what we see on the upper right-hand corner. This allows you to make that 45-degree angle and then continue it on underneath or whatever the case may be. Then the angle is on the interior side of the structure. Now, I know there are times that we have to try to figure out a way to make everything work, but what do you think happens in that design? Look at how thin that concrete is. Yeah. Although I've had a lot of people say, but what am I going to do for my carpet tax? I'm like, I get that, but what are you going to do with your crumbling floor? So it's a trade-off there thinking about it. But there are times that may be the only option you have. But you can place it on the interior side, and a lot of times, the structural engineers are talking about you need a control joint there. And they have been, and it's not always, but they have been saying there are times that you can use that insulation there as your control joint for it. So, I don't know, just throwing it out there as an option. Insulation, we talked about a little bit. Air barriers. Air barriers are incredibly important because the reality is if we don't have an air barrier, we really don't have insulation, because the way insulation gets its R value is by having stagnant pockets of air. So if you have air moving through that, you basically strip those R values and you have a material in an assembly doing absolutely nothing. Now, just like this, right? We got our fleece jacket, it's outside, we're warm until the wind blows on us and we go, ooh. But if we put on a windbreaker over that fleece coat, right, we're good. I always look because I said windbreaker. I was teaching this group, these college kids, right, these young kids. And I said windbreaker, just like deer in the headlight look at me. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And I'm talking, and then this one kid goes, I'm like, yeah. And he's like, did you mean a shell? And I'm like, oh my gosh. I feel so old. So now I look in the room, so I decide, do I say shell or do I say windbreaker? Me, it's a windbreaker. Never heard of, well, I mean, I heard of shells, but anyway. The idea is we want to ensure that we don't have this. Anybody know what this is? The discolorization we have on that insulation? Not mold. Debris and stuff all brought in by dirt, all brought in by air. Because there was no air barrier there to stop. What happens if those little pockets of stagnant air are filled with dirt and debris? Do we still have that R value? Nope. That's why it's so important to have an air barrier going on. I always say it should be a Siamese twin design. Wherever you have insulation that's for the thermal envelope, you should also have an air barrier with it. And a lot of times the insulation manufacturers actually call out that my insulation needs to have a 6-sided encapsulation. And that's part of it, because obviously they want their insulation to perform properly, but you got to ensure that everything else is there to do it. Now, what 103.2 tells us is we have to provide a detail for our air barriers. In my opinion, just the world according to Hope, it specifically says a detail. It does not say writing it out and everything. And I really feel that a picture is worth 1,000 words, because this section, this table that we're going to talk about real quick, every code cycle, it gets messed with 1,001 times. Everybody's putting in review or code changes to it because the words that are written in there is not happening out in the field because it's getting interpreted. They're like, well, we need to reword it. Well, there's a perfect example, because you can read a sentence, you can read a sentence, I can read a sentence, and we're all going to interpret it different ways, and that's because we all have different life experiences that play into how we interpret these codes. So if we have a picture, we're less likely going to interpret what those words are saying because we have an image telling us exactly what it is that we want to do, or that we want everybody else to do. Something else to be aware of, right? We've got 3 air changes per hour, which is the requirement out of the code. It also allows for a new testing metric. So there, and if I remember correctly, in this one, I'm just going to throw it out there, I believe Aspen has an amendment to this section. I didn't throw it in there because I thought if I put in all the amendments in this overall, we'd never get through this, and you guys would be like here at 7 o'clock and hating me. And I don't want you hating me yet. That'll come later. Okay, so the new testing metric actually allows you to utilize the CFM per square foot, so you're not reliant on that volume to it. But it's only permitted when you have a multifamily that's 1,500 square feet, or a multifamily or a home that's 1,500 square feet or less. So basically, small dwelling units is where it can come into play. We've got thermostats. This really hasn't changed a whole lot. We all know we got to have programmable thermostats. It's got to have the capability of, different times, or 7 days a week, different times during that day, so that it makes sense, right? If we're not there, do we need to have it heated to 90 degrees? Probably not. 70 is just fine, and then when we get home, or before we're going to get home, we have it set up to kind of kick up that, hey, I want it 75 degrees. So it has that capability to it. Heat pumps, how many of you are dealing with heat pumps? So there are some requirements, and basically the real big requirement for it is a control to ensure that as long as the heat pump can handle the loads that it's coming on, that the supplemental heat isn't kicking on too, so that we don't have it both on at the same time. We have a boiler temperature reset. We do have that. Basically, we have a system that's going on that says, hey, the outdoor temperature is this. It's 80 degrees outside. We probably don't need the boiler going on and heating the interior of the house, but if it's 30 degrees outside, then we know it's time to kick everything on. So it's kind of like a fail-safe so that the boiler system isn't kind of kicking in a little bit. I think of it as, think about how when you have your AC going, and maybe you have your AC down to like 60 degrees, but you have your heating set at 65, all of a sudden, you know, your boiler is trying to kick on. This kind of says, hey, you know what, I know it seems really cool in here. They don't need the heat because it's 100 degrees outside, right? So it's kind of helping with all of that. All right, so our ducts, keeping our ducts in a row. We want to ensure that we insulate our ducts. And it's really dependent on the size of the duct. So if you're 3 inches or less, then you only have to insulate it to an R6. If you're 3 inches or greater, then you're going to insulate it to an R8. Now, there were 2 new sections that were added, and it's ductwork if it's buried underneath the building, or ductwork that's underground ducts. This is not necessarily talking about ductwork like in a crawl space. What they're talking about is, you know, like in those big complexes, apartment complexes, sometimes you'll run ductwork underground or underneath the building, getting it to the other building. That's more along the lines of what they're talking about. Because remember, on the residential side, R2s, R3s, and R4s that are 3 stories or less have to fall under this. Now, this is a very important section to be aware of. How many of you know of ducts located in conditioned space, the criteria that we're going to talk about? Okay, good. I'm glad. This is incredibly important because there happens to be a additional efficiency option that basically says if you place all of your ductwork inside conditioned space, we're going to call it good and you can move on with life. But for it to be considered in conditioned space, all the ductwork would have to be inside that thermal envelope. That isn't always an option, right? There may be times that it doesn't work. So the code says, okay, we get that. Maybe what we do, I'll show you some pictures. So if we looked at this one, would you say inside or out? That's in, yeah, because I know the glare on it. I don't know why it's glaring there because my picture has no glare on it. But that's the underside of the roof deck, so that ductwork is inside the thermal envelope. What about this one? Why do you say no?
Well, it depends on where the insulation is.
Ah, good. Did you say no right away because you saw insulation on the ductwork and thought, well, if it's insulated?
There's no insulation above the ductwork.
But there's
Keep
also,
it in the envelope, and it's not on the roof either.
Well, there is a lot on there. So a lot of people look at this and they're like, oh yeah, there's insulation on that ductwork. It must mean that it's going to be outside the thermal envelope. That doesn't always mean that that's the case. They just insulated it. But let's say you maybe wanted to consider that to be inside conditioned space. How you're going to do that is you're going to comply with 403.3.3, and you're also going to comply with the requirements of this section, which is 2.1 through 2.3. I know that's very confusing, so the first thing we're going to do is jump on over to 403.3.3. And this is the ductwork being buried inside the ceiling insulation. So basically, for it to be considered with, in conditioned space, you're going to have to ensure that you meet a few things. One is that insulation is going to have to be an R8 around that ductwork, no matter the size of it. I think most of the ductwork that we're dealing with is larger than 3 inches anyway, but it does need to be insulated to an R8. The next thing you're going to ensure is that you have an R19 surrounding that duct, and it does not include that R8 of the insulation around the duct. So you got 8 and 19, so you're going to have 19 below it, around the sides, and then 19 above it. And that will give you the opportunity to consider it inside the thermal envelope per 403.3.3. You still have to do 2.1 through 2.3, but at least it gives you a good idea here. So as you can see, oh, I forgot the pointer. As you can see here, we got an R8 insulation around the ductwork. We're showing our ceiling. That's that jet board right there. Hope does great when you can add a shape. But if you saw Hope drawing, that's why Hope is a code official and not an architect, okay? So now we see that we have R19 below that ductwork, and we have R19 above that ductwork. So the thing that you need to keep in mind in these designs is how are you going to ensure that that ductwork is maintaining that there's at least an R19 below it, because it cannot rest on top of that gyp board. So that's something to just be aware of. Now,
Does this apply for like exhaust ductwork, or is
this is just supply and return. Yep. Exhaust at this point is not included into these parameters, which don't give people ideas. Not me, just others. So the next one is 2.1 through 2.3. So we also have to ensure that the air handler is inside the thermal envelope. You have to demonstrate that when you do your duct leakage test, you don't leak more than 1.5. And basically what number 3 is saying is we're ensuring that the insulation has a bump to it, right? It can't be we have an R49 and the ductwork is here and the insulation is level. That does not mean we have R19 above and R19 below. We need to have bumps going on to ensure that that R19 is going around that ductwork. That's basically what they're trying to say there, is you can't just look at a flat insulation surface and think we're good to go. Yes?
So does the duct leakage test include the equipment?
You have your choice. It doesn't say whether it has to have the equipment or not, but if you go into the section for the duct leakage, it says you can do it at pre-construction with or without the equipment, or you can do it at post-construction. So this is the world according to Hope, I think at this point, because it doesn't specify, it's dealer's choice. Because if it was one way or the other, then it should specify that in that section. So here's a drawing. This was actually, I'm not going to tell you where it was in Colorado. This is drawing because somebody asked me a question and they were trying to describe it to me in an email. And I was like, well, I was on a completely different section. And then when they drew it for me, I'm like, oh, I see now what you're saying. So they were calling out that it didn't meet the ductwork within conditioned space. And the reason why they were saying it is because right here, where the ductwork is penetrating the gyp board, it doesn't have an R19 below it. And it was basically the plans examiner was saying, how are you going to have an R19 below it? And the inspector was like, but that's what the code says. This is like the world of black and white, and this is the world of gray over here. So the plans examiner reached out to me, and once he drew it, I'm like, well, yeah, you're always going to have a spot where that ductwork is penetrating. Otherwise, why do you have ductwork up in the attic space anyway? You're just spinning it around there. And I said, no, as long as everything else has that 19 below, 19 above, and you got a spot where the ductwork is penetrating through, it's good. It meets the intent of what the code is.
It's inevitable, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, yes.
In that same box, though, you have an issue potentially with there not being enough insulation above, where it's like pinched into the eave or roof there.
That could be a problem too, because it does say an R19 above and an R19 below. This again is the world according to Hope, okay? How I would look at that is We have it in there. Everywhere else, it's getting that R19 above and R19 below. They are placing it in this spot where it's not quite getting it, or it's getting it compressed. But it's getting it compressed because it's doing its turn to go down to probably, I think it was going into a chase, going down to where it needed to go. Yes, by the absolute letter of the code, it's supposed to have a 19 above and a 19 below, but at some point, you're going to have a little bit of a shift in that because you're trying to get that ductwork to where it's supposed to be. So, I like your question. All right, number 3 in that is if you have ductwork that happens to be in a floor cavity. At this point, now what we're going to do is you have to ensure that the floor meets whatever floor cavity R value requirement you have, right, per what the table says. The other thing you have to do is ensure that you have an air barrier separating that insulation and ductwork from where it's unconditioned, which really isn't an additional item because that's already required out of the air barrier section. But you are going to ensure that you have a minimum of an R19 below the ductwork where it's it's separating the ductwork from that unconditioned space below. So here's an example, right? We have our air barrier, we have our bump out, and then an R19 that's demonstrating that we have at least an R19 and the rest of the cavity is having the full amount to it. So if we look at this image here, are you going to be able to meet the requirement out of that section? If there was spray foam, potentially, you can get spray foam. You could potentially get spray foam that might get you down close to that R15, but what I can tell you is, yeah, it basically was at the point where it was just a little over 2 inches from the bottom of the ductwork to where the floor design was going to go. So, yeah. Well, the other thing too is there's all this space above. And so they had all this space above, but where the ductwork was being placed was at that lower spot. And if it had just been moved up a little bit, and there was really, not a lot of reason for why not, it just was a problem. What about this? Do you think this will make it? Yep, they did. It's definitely sealed. Yeah, so they have to get enough insulation from here to here. And in that instance, I think they have a better shot of getting an R19 than that previous picture. What about this one? Under the duct. Yeah, we aren't doing so good on a lot of these. And all it is it's a little bit more planning to be able to do this, right? And it only kicks in if you're trying to demonstrate that you want to put your ductwork in conditioned space so that you meet the requirement for the additional efficiencies, requirements, whatever.
99% of our builders now, everything's going to conditioned space.
Yeah, where everything's inside. That's probably the easiest thing to do.
I don't think we rarely deal with being in unconditioned anymore.
Well, you are very lucky. You can fall asleep then for the rest of this section, but I'm going to wake you up in a moment.
No, that's my estimator will be asleep.
Ah, okay. Well, I don't know who's sleeping here. All right, so now if you put ductwork in an exterior wall and you want to demonstrate that it meets the requirement within conditioned space, what you're going to do is ensure that there is an air barrier that's separating the ductwork from the unconditioned space. We're going to ensure that we have at least an R10 be separating the ductwork from the exterior. And then the remainder of that space is going to have the remainder of the insulation, whatever that's going to be. So you can see here how it's set up. We got our air barrier, we got an R10, and then we have the remainder all around it. So if we were wanting to go with the total building performance option, and we wanted to demonstrate that our ductwork was buried within the conditioned space, we're not going to follow everything that we just walked through, but what you are going to follow is R403.3.3.1. This is only if you're going with the total building performance. So in this one, you're going to comply with 403.3.3, which is where 19 below, 19 above, insulated to an R8. You're also going to ensure that that ductwork is located within 5.5 inches, 5.5 inches of where the ceiling is. So you can't have it way up here. You're basically putting it right here so that you barely get that R19 below it. Well, I mean, you have more room for it, but. And then the other thing is that the design will be considered to have a value of an R25. That's what goes into the software when they're putting that information into it. I would say that this probably is not utilized all that often, but it is available. And we might see more of it with the requirement of the additional efficiency options. We got to ensure that we seal up all of our ductwork. Now I know this is a commercial project, but it definitely illustrates when you don't seal things up and the consequences that can happen with it. What I'm going to say is this was at a restaurant, and I'm just sitting there staring at it thinking about, I wonder what additional type of seasoning I am going to get with my food today. So I took a picture of it. So this is for you. So this is where you have the options about when you want to test. You can test at rough-in, and then you can also test at post-construction. If you do it at rough-in, it does allow for you with equipment or without the equipment in there. Now, I think this one, I have to go back. I know in the 24 it absolutely says now third party, but I think it is saying in the 21 too that it's a third party. Yeah, I know in the 24 it did, and I know it changed. I just can't remember if it changed in the 21 or it changed in the 24.
Be prepared.
Be prepared, yes.
Is this for like ERV system or ventilation or exhaust ventilation as well, or is it just like the heating and cooling?
It's basically you're testing the ductwork that's heating and cooling. Your ERVs are exempt as long as they're not integrated into that heating and cooling system. So if it's a separate system, have fun with it. Doesn't have to do any of the testing, but if for some reason it's integrated into that heating and cooling system, then it is included in the testing.
Because on your ERV is basically transferring all your interior there anyway.
Yeah, for us, I don't see a lot of systems, ERV systems that are integrated, but there are parts of the country where they do integrate them, so.
All of ours are integrated.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Almost all.
All right, well then, yes, those are going under test. So here's the really new one. If it's not, you're trying to demonstrate that you meet the inside conditioned space, we're getting the 1.5. Previous editions of the code just said you had to meet 3 if there wasn't an air handler and 4 if there was an air handler. So in my world, if somebody said, tested and had a 4.1, I'm like, well, that's still 4, right? Because it's in the realm of 4. Apparently, people didn't like that, so they submitted a code change that says, no, we mean 3.0 and 4.0. So now if you get 4.1, you don't pass. You're going to have to take a look and see where the issues are. It also says in the past, if you had your ductwork within the thermal envelope, you were exempt from testing. Now in the 21, you do have to test, but you get the option of being leakier because the person who submitted this, his theory was that it's leaking into conditioned space, so what does it matter? and I'm kind of on the realm of, well, it messes up your mechanical system. If it's leaking so much, you're not getting the CFM to the destination that it was designed for. But Hope was outvoted, and it doesn't really matter because it's in the code now. All right, heat trace. Anybody put heat trace on their systems here? If you do, it is required that it meet the appropriate standards, and basically you're also going to ensure that there are controls for it. The controls are really only there to ensure that the system is running when it needs to be running, and if the temperature is warm enough outside that the liquid is not going to freeze, that it doesn't need to be on. Hot water needs to be insulated. So if we have anything that's greater than or 3/4 of an inch or greater, we're going to have to insulate it. It just has to be insulated to an R3. And then in all of these locations, that's where we're going to have to pay attention to it. Our, let's see, mechanical ventilation. So our mechanical ventilation here. Remember that we're talking about dealing with like our air leakage going on with the ventilation system. So in this one in the past, this is where we found the information considering or for our dampers that said, hey, they can be automatic, they can be gravity, and we can call it good. Now there's a section in here, and basically it says if you comply with the air leakage requirements, right? So we're 3 air changes or less, and you have to ensure that you install a whole house mechanical ventilation system in there. Well, the other thing that happened in the 21 is you're required in climate zone 7 to also put in an ERV or an HRV. So that kind of takes care of that for you. Now, oh, I guess I should have just waited a slide and told you. Surprise, guess what? In climate zone 7, you have to install an ERV or an HRV. Not only do you have to install it, you also have to ensure that your sensible recovery efficiency is 65% or better when it's at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Anybody know where you find that information? Find it in the specs. And here is one, because they all have stickers on them. Well, I shouldn't say they all should have stickers on them that provides that information. So in this one, we're looking for our SRE, and our SRE is showing that we have heating at 83%, cooling at 70%, but our heating is 83% at 32 degrees. So for this particular requirement, it meets it because it only has to be a minimum of 65, and it's saying that it's 83.
Most of our municipalities have raised that up to 85.
Have they? Well, I know that there were some amendments. And I just didn't put them in here.
Which is quite a bit different. That's in the Aspen and Penn County code.
Yeah,
They're the two that are requiring us to do it right now.
Well, it's got something to do with blocks for CFM too.
It's
Yeah,
lots
you've-
of them, it's gotta be premium and
yeah.
expensive is what it spells.
What I will say is, like I said, I made the decision that when we do the deep dive into these specific topics, you know, we're doing residential mechanical, we can then pull in all of the amendments because there are some amendments. We're just kind of looking at what the base code is a little bit, and then we'll dive deeper into all of the amendments because I was concerned that if I threw in all of the amendments when we're doing the overview of this is what it's saying, it would get really confusing because the amendments are, there are some that are similar and there are some that are definitely not similar. We'll just put it that way. So,
It's difficult when you deal in every different municipality. Right?
yeah, absolutely,
You know,
absolutely.
I mean, we also don't have to follow this in Norfolk County. You know, I mean, it's interesting.
Well, then, you know, there's always new things. There's always tweaks that happen with it. All right, so fan efficiencies. So we have to ensure that the fan efficiencies, this is really talking about for those whole house mechanical fans, right? Your ERVs, HRVs, if you're using exhaust only because you're not in climate zone 7, or supply only, or a combination thereof, a balanced system. All of that has to meet the CFM efficiencies per whatever testing procedure that you would have to do. So most of you are really looking at that very top row there that are in climate zone 7. What I will say is, honestly, I haven't seen specs of this type of equipment that doesn't meet what's in this table. Not saying that it can't happen, but that manufacturers just are not going to manufacture or continue to manufacture something that doesn't meet code, right? They might have it and try to get it out of their storage, but they aren't going to make new ones.
Yeah, but the only thing is all their stuff is tested at sea level. All
Yeah.
that changes when they get to our elevation, being so we're the anomaly, not the norm. It does change it.
Well, that's the case for all of our mechanical equipment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
So most engineers don't understand the effective altitude.
no, I get that because I do a lot of teaching in Minnesota. Well, they're at 600 feet above sea level. They're sea level, right? And so, like, when I start talking about like duration and understanding that it's not something that they
It's a
necessarily,
concept
yeah.
they get. And a lot of manufacturers don't. They're mostly down in Houston or, they're
But I have seen a lot where they will say, like, for elevations, and this might be for, and I'm thinking it might have been an exhaust system, but they'll say, like, for elevations, 3,000 or more above sea level, to obtain this, you have to have a duct size of the 6-inch. So they do sometimes provide that alternative approach for it to accommodate for the elevation, but you're right. There is some discrepancy in the fact that, especially,
you just have to derate it.
yeah. All right, so here's the fun one. All of your ventilation systems. This is one that, and I told them that they put this in the wrong code, but they said it should go in the energy code because the people who are going to do the testing are the same people that are testing like the ductwork and stuff. And I'm like, but you're making it everything out of the IRC for ventilation and out of the IECC. It has to be tested. And there isn't like a set number, like everything has to be a 3 or whatever. It's basically you're going to ensure that they're meeting the CFMs that we see here, or you're meeting the CFMs that it was designed for. Like, if you designed a system and your whole house mechanical ventilation is going to be 60 CFM, however it is, when they go out there, they're going to test to make sure that you're getting out 60 CFM. So it's not necessarily like there's a table that it has to go to. It's what it's being designed for, is what you're validating on it. And so the only real exception out there is dealing with kitchen range hoods. As long as it's being ducted to the outside, it's 6 inches or greater, and it only has one 90-degree elbow to it.
That's what you have to test those, you said.
Yeah, every sort of ventilation system you have is going to be tested. The only exception is if it happens to be a kitchen range hood. And as long as the ductwork is 6 inches or greater, it's ducted directly to the outside. And it only has one 90-degree elbow. That's the only exemption from having to do testing of that system. All right, manual J's. We got to ensure that we have a manual J to make sure that we size the equipment according to manual S. So this is not all that new. It's been in the code for quite some time. In the IRC, it actually goes way back, what is it, the 91? I can't remember how far back we saw. I think it was the 91. That it's been in there. It's been in there for 30 years, 30 some odd years. So it's a requirement, it's been in there. Now there is an exception in here. Well, not an exception, but what it does talk about is both new and replacement equipment must meet the minimum efficiency of it. It doesn't say that replacement equipment necessarily has to have a manual J, but that replacement equipment does have to meet the minimum efficiency of that equipment. Now, because we have systems or we have multifamily that falls under the residential side, if that multifamily mechanical system is not each individual unit has its own mechanical system, it actually has a single system that is doing multiple units. It no longer has to comply with the residential side of the code because it's basically a commercial system. It needs to now go into C403 and follow the parameters of C403 and C404, which is the service water heating component of it. Now, this one you might have a few things involved with it. Snow melt and ice melt systems, we've got to have controls basically that shuts it off when there's no precipitation, when the pavement is greater than 50 degrees and it's warmer than 40 degrees outside. So it's not all that unusual, pretty typical. I'm sure you guys have probably had 1 or 2 snow melt systems in your career, right? Yeah, so we have that. Lighting. So for our lighting, we are required to have it be 100% high efficacy. So basically everything has to fall into that, but they put an exception in there dealing with kitchen appliances. So they're not saying that the light in the fridge has to be a high efficacy bulb, or the light in the oven has to be a high efficacy bulb or dryer, but everything else now has to be fully high efficacy bulbs. Exterior lighting. So if we recall, R2s, R3s, and R4s have to pay attention to the residential side of the energy code. If they were 4 stories, they would have all this criteria about how to deal with exterior lighting, you know, power densities, controls, the whole 9 yards. Now, in the 21, there is a section to deal with the R2s, R3s, and R4s. And if you notice, there is an exception in there that says detached 2-family and townhouses are not needing to comply with this. So in this section, what you're going to do is you're going to ensure that either you're going to comply with C405.5, so it does direct you back to the commercial side. Now it does say, along with the exceptions that are in there, the single family and all that, but if you have solar powered lights that are attached to that, then that works. If you have luminaires that are controlled by motion sensors, so they only come on when they sense something there, or if you have lamps or luminaires that fully comply with 404.1, which is 100% high efficacy, then you don't have to go into C405.5. I have to think, because we're doing 21, dealt with 24, and I'm on the committee to do 27, so sometimes the sections get mixed up. But here's an example, right? If they did have to go into C405.5, we would get something like an exterior comm check, and then here was for an apartment, here's the lighting that was attached for it, and we would call that good. Fuel gas lighting equipment, you still can have it at this point. I think there was a couple of amendments in a couple of jurisdictions for it. I didn't put it in here. We just have to ensure that it is not a continuously burning pilot light. Now, let's talk about our interior lighting for everybody. For this, basically, you're going to have either a dimmer, an occupancy sensor, or there's a control that's already installed into that fixture itself, by the manufacturer. All of your lighting is going to have one of those types of controls. Now, there is some exceptions. The bathroom, the hallway, exterior lighting, and anything that would be designated for safety and security. Now, the safety and security option that's listed in here to be exempt is not necessarily saying, well, Hope will trip up the stairs if there's no lighting in her house. That part is really talking about those R2s, R3s, and R4s that are 3 stories or less, and they have those stairwells and so forth that are, inside the building. They're saying that those areas are not required to have occupancy sensors. So that, I just want to make that clear when they're talking about, safety and security. Those are the types of things. They were taking into account that these were not all single family dwelling units, that we were going to have multifamily involved with it. The other thing that was really nice in the 21 is they put definitions about what an occupancy sensor is, and they also put in a definition about what a dimmer is. Now, it talked about other control devices that were basically integrated into that fixture already. So my question for you is, we have to have occupancy sensors in all these locations. Would we consider where it has the little remote control to turn on and off? Would we consider that as meeting the intent? Would we consider a system that is ran by an iPad or an app part of that? Would we consider Alexa as an option to meet those requirements? I'm asking you.
I would say no.
Ooh, we have no and yes. Okay. For no, why do you say no?
Because is it really sensing your occupancy until you pick it up?
That's
It's the same as a switch being on the wall until you push it.
all right.
No better dimmer switch though.
But you can set it to turn on and off at certain times.
In certain instances, yeah. For the programmable one, you can, because you have that schedule system in there. I'm not sure about Alexa. I don't have an Alexa. I don't need an additional body in my house. But I'm not sure about Alexa. So what do you say?
Well, your remote, you've got to be there and occupy it to use it.
Yeah?
Your iPad, you can set up your whole control system through that for occupied, unoccupied. And Alexa, I've got them throughout my house. You have to talk to it, so you got to be there. I mean, it's occupied.
Yeah. Well, I honestly, this is not the world according to Hope. This is really to make you think about it, right? Because it doesn't always have to be black and white. There's some gray to it. And honestly, an occupancy sensor, in a bedroom, I had this where, you roll over, lights go on, yay, that's so wonderful. But I could think about if you had an app on your phone. Anybody have apps on, first, anybody have a phone? All right, anybody put apps on their phone? I had somebody get mad at me because I said, anybody have an app? And they're like, how do you know we have phones? And I'm like, okay, so let me ask, do we have phones? All right, so on that app, on the apps that you have, you think if by chance you forgot to turn off a light, or you have teenagers who don't think about turning off the lights because we have occupancy sensors now or whatever, they just don't think about it anymore, and you have your iPad or you had your phone and you're away, wouldn't it be great? And doesn't it meet the intent if you just push the little button and it says, oh, I'll turn that light off for you? You think that could be energy efficient? I think it could. Thermostat, that's another one. I actually do this entire class on let's think outside of the box. Does this work? Why doesn't this work? So yeah, I I agree. I think things like this or things like this could be incredibly valuable for energy efficiency. I also like these too, right? They turn on when you walk into the room and they turn off, well, in theory, when you're gone, right? I think that they would be a value in all of this. So if we look at this, we know we got to have occupancy sensors or something of that nature. Did they comply? How many of you say they comply with this requirement? Raise your hand. Whoops. How many of you say they do not comply? Raise your hand. How many of you aren't sure? Raise your hand, and you're hoping that Hope's going to explain this. All right. Okay. Well, usually I have a pointer and I can point to it. But so we're showing on this plan, they're showing motion sensors in quite a few locations on that plan to let me know, hey, it's got an occupancy sensor located on it. The place that they missed putting it was in the kitchen. So they did a really good job up until the point of the kitchen. And honestly, I'll tell you that they did a really good job all throughout this project. The one thing I could point to was the kitchen. So, yeah, that's something to think about. Now, I will tell you, at the code hearings, I fought this tooth and nail. And the reason I fought it tooth and nail is because I actually installed occupancy sensors in my house. It was an 800 square foot house, so it wasn't like I had 40,000 of them going on there. But I had it in the kitchen, and I thought that would be a great thing. Problem is, if you're standing there cutting things up and you're just cooking, there's not enough movement. It doesn't register it, and it shuts off. Or I had, a 180-pound Newfoundland, and so he loved laying down in the kitchen at night because it's tile floor, it's really cool, and he would roll over. You know what happens? The light comes on, and when you are in bed and a light comes on and you're not expecting a light to come on, what do? You jump out of bed thinking, something's coming in. So, which you would think I would know because I have a 180-pound Newfoundland, He should have woken me up, but you don't think about that when you're asleep. So, if you're a single family, two-family townhouse, there are requirements for exterior lighting. So when you have your exterior lighting, all of it, it totals more than 30 watts. Now you're going to have to comply with this. You're going to have a controlled manual on-off switch that allows for you to automatically turn it off. You're also going to have where it shuts off when there's enough daylight going on with it. You can have an override on that. It will allow you to have an override and stay on, but after 24 hours, it resets back to what the original programming, I guess you could call it, would be. Now, there is exceptions on there, I want to say, and I don't have it on here. I thought if you had solar powered, but that might be the other one that I'm thinking of. So here's an example of where they included timers on it. So it basically came on and shut off at a certain time of the day, and it did have a sequence of operation for override on it that would reset it back up. All right, we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is not me, just so you know. What we're going to talk about is the additional efficiency requirements. So if you'll notice right here, it says you're going to comply with section 401.2.5 and then one of these other ones. These other ones are about the compliance path you choose. 401.2.5 is dealing with the additional efficiency requirement. So if you're prescriptive, you just must pick one and comply with it. If you happen to be going with the total building performance, you have an option here. Your option is you can either pick one and not include it into your design, or you can demonstrate that your proposed design is 5% better than what the reference design is. Now, if you're going with the ERI, you now have to demonstrate your project is 5% better than what the numbers in the table is. So if the table said you had to get a 52 as your number, now you have to get it something that's 5% better. We're going to pretend that the math tells us that it's 50 because Hope is not going to try to do the math up here on its own. And so basically that's what you're going to show. All right, so we have some options coming in here. Here is what I wanted to show you. So we have to show that we're 95%, the top one is for the total building performance. So when it says that, you know, the proposed design is showing 2,049 and the cost is 1,775 for the proposed design, that's 95% of it, so we could call it good. And for, if climate zone 5, it's 55 number you have to get, 5% better is 52.25, which would be a 52 because everybody says, no, you got to round down for these numbers. So if it's a fraction, a lot of jurisdictions are requiring you to round down, just so that you're aware. So let's talk about what some of these options actually are. All right, so the first one is you're going to demonstrate that your thermal envelope is 5% better than the proposed design, really. So basically what you are required to do is you have to utilize res check, the total UA option, and then demonstrate that what your design is 5% better than what the base would be. Normally I would say that's not bad. And I've had people say, well, you know, how did this make it in? And with all the increase in values of the thermal envelope, but there was the camp that said, hey, leave the table alone. Let's just work through the additional efficiencies. And then there was people that said, you know, forget the additional efficiencies. Let's work within the table. Unfortunately, both of them won. So now we have a higher table and we have additional efficiencies. So in this one, to be able to comply, we're going to have to pay attention to a lot of things. What are we doing for air barriers? Our insulation is going to have to be, fairly significant depending on where we're at. Our windows are going to have to be really good windows to show that we're 5% better than what the base code would be. Next one is having more efficient HVAC equipment. So what we would want to have is really dependent, and I've had this question a couple of times because of the new efficiency standards that are out there. So this was developed before all the AFUE2s, SEER2s came in. So if you choose this, it may be a discussion on how to apply it, check with the jurisdiction how they're addressing the SEER and SEER2 and all that on there. But basically, as long as your equipment meets what's listed here, you get to count it as your additional efficiency and be done with it. So we're going to want to, pay attention to this. The other thing is I like to always bring up, remember, not all mechanical equipment and the efficiency applies across all of the states. There's a nice little sticker that says, hey, this works in this state, but doesn't work in that state. So keep that in mind. You can have reduced energy usage of your service water heating equipment. This is, again, another one where the metric changed right after the code was developed. So it's not EF, it's UEF now, or EUF. So keep that in mind. This one I think is probably pretty doable because we see a lot of equipment that is already meeting that stuff. This is the absolute easiest one. Put all your ductwork inside the thermal envelope. You do that, you're done. That's why I brought up all those things about having it in conditioned space, because once it's considered in conditioned space, guess what? It falls under this. And then you've met the intent of it and you are golden. Because this is a pretty easy one, I think, to really design for, and it's not much more than what we're already doing. Improved air sealing, and then also using an ERV or an HRV. So it says you have to be less than 3. You have to have an ERV or an HRV, and it has to have an SRE of at least 75%, which you're already having to hit. It also says that the latent recovery has to be at least 50%. So for ERVs. So this may be one that's probably more doable, and in the amendments that I was looking at, there wasn't anything that said that what you're doing for that doesn't work for this. So, and I'm not outright saying that, but when I was looking at all of that, I didn't see anything that would contradict that.